Emily lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The room was dark. Bright streetlights shone through the window. Night moths swirled in their light. Their dance mesmerized her, even soothed her. Sleep did not come to the girl. Various thoughts about work, the future, and the past popped into her head.
Upstairs, the neighbors were noisy as usual. They were laughing loudly, talking, even singing songs. That would have been all right, but today was Wednesday. Emily had to get up early for work tomorrow. At 6 a.m., it was a long way to the bus stop, and the drive itself took almost an hour. Emily wondered how her neighbors lived. Okay, the old people got pensions, but the young? The family on the top floor is having a party right now. Do they really live on children's allowances? And the neighbors have a lot of kids.
Dirty, hungry, in rags, perky. They grow like weeds. They're often sick, even die, because of parental neglect. Like that boy last year, Jason, I think a 1.5-year-old toddler walked out of the house at night in the winter while his parents were out drinking. They didn't even notice the child wasn't home. They only realized it the next day at lunchtime. But it was too late, the baby had frozen. The older children were taken away from the family. But a year later, the parents had a new baby. And now the neighbor was pregnant again. Emily sighed as she looked at the lives of these children. She realized that she herself was lucky. It could have been worse. Emily had grown up in an orphanage. Yes, she lacked the warmth and care of loved ones, but she was fed, clean, and clothed. In the orphanage, she was trained as a pastry chef, and when she turned 18, the state gave her an apartment in an old wooden 2-story barrack house on the outskirts of the city. Dusty, unasphalted streets, overgrown with grass. Dumps everywhere, garbage was rarely taken out. Every now and then the water, electricity, and heating were cut off. Cockroaches crawled around the apartments. The neighborhood was dysfunctional. Mostly marginal families lived here, like the neighbors upstairs. Also old people and ordinary but poor people with no means to move. Creaking floors, old rickety frames, the smell of damp and mold. But what frightened Emily most of all were the thin walls. Through them she could hear everything from the neighboring apartments. This was the kind of place Emily had gotten. And what to do? There was no choice. She was alone in the world. After coming of age, she had to move out of the orphanage. Where to go? She didn't want to be homeless. So the orphanage graduated and settled in an old barracks with frightening neighbors. But Emily knew that time would pass. She would earn money for an apartment and move away from here to a good place. Now there was a fight brewing upstairs. Usually first there's drinking, fun, dancing, all brothers and sisters. Then there's bound to be conflict, even fights. Squealing, screaming, hitting, the sound of falling furniture and broken dishes. Emily is scared of it all, even though she's lived like this for 2 years. Sometimes drunken neighbors would get the wrong floor and break in her door. Often the debauches happened right under her windows, either fights or romantic scenes. Old Susan, the old lady for whom Emily shopped, was also wary of the neighbors. Emily was an attractive young girl. She should have gotten out of here. The people in this place were not good. Trouble could happen at any moment. Emily realized this and dreamed of moving somewhere else. However, she didn't have that opportunity yet. In Emily's house repeatedly happened fires, almost always because of drunken neighbors. A guest from the top floor fell asleep with a cigarette on the couch, or the neighbor on the right forgot to remove the pot from the stove after getting drunk. Each time, the firefighters got there in time. But the unpleasant smell of burning was a lingering reminder of the incident. Emily was afraid that one day while she slept, a fire would start in the house. The only consolation was that her apartment was on the first floor, and she would be able to jump out quickly. Emily rolled over onto her other side, turning away from the fire. She should get some sleep. Tomorrow was a big day. There would be guests at the rich house where she worked as a maid. Some kind of family celebration. They need people to serve the guests and clean up. Emily will be a waitress. John Susan, an older man with gray hair and kind blue eyes, explained to the servants how to behave during the celebration. Nothing complicated. Don't talk to the guests. Don't attract attention. Slowly shuttle around the territory with a tray of snacks and drinks. Keep an eye on the invitees. If someone makes a sign, walk over so the person can have a treat. These will be people from a very different life. They never had to spend the night in an old barracks with creaks, piles of garbage, floors, and crowds of cockroaches. They don't have drunken neighbors keeping them up at night. These lucky people wear expensive fancy clothes, fly to exotic places with luxurious names, drive beautiful cars. A different world that Emily had only ever been able to observe from the outside. After a day of work in the midst of beauty and luxury, it was unpleasant and painful for Emily to return to her shabby apartment. From upstairs came swearing and profanity. A man's husky voice shouted foul language, and a woman's voice responded with equally harsh words. Emily covered her ears, not wanting to hear it. It was getting dreary. The gray life seemed bleak, joyless, and alien. Then Emily remembered her early childhood, a time when she was truly happy. A sunny summer morning. Her mother was tying her a beautiful bow. The girl admired her reflection in the mirror. Just a doll, smiled her mother, correcting the collar of the dress of her favorite daughter, and they would go to the park. Mom was on vacation. They didn't go to the sea, they didn't have enough money. Emily understood that perfectly well, even at the age of 7. But her mother promised to take her daughter to the amusement park and allowed her to choose any swings and merry-go-rounds without restrictions. How pleasant it was to walk hand in hand with her mother down the alley to the park, from where music, cheerful chatter, and children's laughter were already coming. It was light and joyful at heart. Emily felt beautiful and happy. And most importantly, her mother was near, always calm and warm. It was a pity that she had to work so much. But Emily understood otherwise. There was no other way, because they had no daddy, so Mom had to pull everything alone. Emily helped as much as she could, cleaning, even learning to cook simple dishes. Emily smiled as she lay in bed. The noise upstairs didn't bother her anymore. She thought of her mom, her slender silhouette, her long hair. Beautiful. What a clear voice she had. But her mother's face was lost in the fog. No matter how hard Emily tried, she couldn't remember its features. Probably because when they were separated forever, Emily was only 9 years old, she barely reached her mother's shoulder. Emily had always admired her mother's face. However, she rarely saw that face in everyday life. It was a shame, but it couldn't be helped. But she still had the pictures. An old, thick album, slightly battered by time. It was practically the only thing Emily had inherited from her mother, except for a simple pair of gold earrings, a chain, and her mother's dainty wristwatch, all of which Emily had received upon graduation from the orphanage. She had nothing else. Emily realized that she and her mother lived poorly and very lonely. Emily had no grandparents or uncles and aunts. It was true that her mom's friends often came to their small apartment. They brought Emily presents and played with her. It was fun and enjoyable, but still not the same. Emily was secretly jealous of her friends who went to visit their grandmothers every now and then. Listening to the girls' stories about the hot cakes and candy the old people gave them, Emily was envious. She, too, wished she had many relatives. The girl, still very young, felt some emptiness in her chest. But she couldn't express her feelings clearly. Sometimes she tried, but her mother hugged her and asked, "Is it bad together?" No, answered the girl. Of course, she was happy with her mom. Emily did not want to upset her favorite person. Therefore, she tried not to ask questions about relatives. And suddenly, Mom will think that Emily is bad with her, since she dreams of someone else. One day, something strange happened. It was New Year's Eve. Mom had some guests over, her co-workers. They all together decorated the Christmas tree, cooked salads, joked a lot, laughed, and even led round dances to the joy of the girl. It was fun. And then Emily was tired and went to bed. And the adults continued the celebration in the kitchen. Emily heard muffled voices coming from there. Her friends were clearly engrossed in conversation. The girl was suddenly bored. She got out of bed and went to the bookcase, deciding to read a little, especially since someone from the guests gave her a big book of brightly colored fairy tales with pictures. But for some reason, the girl took a puffy photo album from the shelf. Emily liked to look at the pictures. The pictures were of her mom, either with friends or alone. Some of the photos preserved moments when Emily wasn't even alive yet. On others, she was already a newborn in a cradle and onesies. There were school pictures of Emily and fresh ones. That evening, the girl noticed that there was something under one of her mother's portraits. Emily gingerly ran her fingers under the picture and pulled out an old, folded-in-half photograph. It was wrinkled, as if someone had been looking at it for a long time. There were strangers looking at the girl from the picture. Among them was her mother, who was very young. Everyone had gathered in the flowering garden, apparently for a picnic, for they were sitting on a blanket spread under the trees. The men and women were smartly and richly dressed. A lady with a heavy gaze and regal posture stood out. High hairstyle, large eyebrows, a mole on her cheek resembling a bold drop of wine, bracelets, a massive necklace. This look somehow didn't fit with the picnic. Even 9-year-old Emily could see that. Strange, why had the photograph turned up hidden? And who were these people? The girl immediately had a lot of questions. And so she, grabbing the mysterious photo, went to the kitchen. "Oh, why aren't you asleep?" wondered Aunt Sandy, one of Mom's friends. She made a quick gesture to hide her cigarette under the table. Emily grinned, as if she hadn't noticed anything, as if she wasn't aware that adults were sneaking smokes from her. It was funny. "Are we making noise disturbing you?" No, Emily shook her head. "I found this interesting picture. I want to know about it." "What kind of picture?" With a smile, her mom held out her hand to the find. Emily saw the picture and turned pale. The smile fell off her face instantly. Aunt Cynthia peered over her mother's shoulder and grew serious as well. "Who's next to you?" Emily asked. "They're different, aren't they?" "They all are," her mother replied in an indifferent tone. "It's nothing special. I used to work with them, these people. They're your colleagues?" "Well, you could say that. Where did you all work together?" "Doing what?" Emily kept up. "Go to bed? It's late?" Her mother said quietly, pushing her daughter toward the kitchen. She left the picture with her. Emily walked out, closing the door behind her, but she didn't go into her room, instead lurking near the kitchen. She thought the adults were about to start discussing the photograph. The girl was not mistaken. "Why do you keep this picture?" Aunt Cynthia asked. "Why do you throw it away?" "I wanted to crumple it up and throw it in the garbage. But then I decided not to, because someday I guess I'll have to tell the truth. But not now, of course. She's just a little girl." Aunt Cynthia's voice was unusually quiet. She seemed to sense something. She saw the way Emily looked at her, like she recognized her grandmother. A call of the blood. No, her mother dismissed her friend's words. "She's just wearing necklaces, rings. The clothes are the most beautiful, flashy." And that mole on her cheek caught her eye. She liked attention. I don't know. I think Emily sensed something familiar, like some elusive trait or something. She did. She recognized her grandmother. I saw the way she looked at her. Oh, her grandmother was a bad person. No good. Emily's lucky she's far away from her. On the one hand, yes, but on the other hand. If Emily lived like a princess now, she'd never be denied anything. And me? I can't even take her to the seaside like a princess, said Aunt Susan contemptuously. Have you forgotten?
Was it a good thing to do to a baby? I remember that, but maybe things are different now, who knows? The conversation then turned to another subject, Aunt Cynthia's many admirers. Emily tiptoed to her bed, covered her head with a blanket, and thought. So that woman in the picture with the mole on her cheek, wearing the necklace, was her grandmother. But her mother had always said they were alone, that they had no one. Why hide the truth? And Aunt Susan said Grandma was a bad person. Why would she think that? What did Grandma do? We'd have to ask her mother about it.
Emily dreaded this conversation, seeing how her mother changed at the sight of the photograph, how frightened she was of something, even pale. Everything must be asked. Only later, when the moment was right. Her mother came quietly into the room. Emily pretended to be asleep. The woman took the album from the table, leafed through it, sighed, and returned the photograph to its place under her portrait. Since then, Emily had often looked at that picture. When her mother wasn't around, of course. The domineering woman with the cold and frankly contemptuous gaze was no stranger to her now. Emily knew it was her grandmother. Perhaps they would even see each other someday. That was Emily's last happy year. The next New Year's Eve she met at the Zaria orphanage. Confused, scared. Because in early December her mother was hit at a crosswalk by a drunk driver at high speed. She was not even taken to the hospital in time. Emily spent a few days with Aunt Cynthia, her mom's friend. And then people came, 2 men in uniform and a woman with a stern, cold stare. Aunt Cynthia gathered her favorite things and hugged her niece. Tears rolled from the woman's eyes. I'll visit you, she promised. For several years in a row, she faithfully visited Emily at the orphanage once or even twice a month. The girl looked forward to these meetings. A familiar loved one reminded her of a past happy life, however. Then Susan met another man of her dreams and left with him to another city. Their dating stopped. By that time, Emily had already quite settled in the orphanage and even made friends. It turned out that life in the orphanage was quite tolerable. Children were well fed, clothed, taught, and entertained. They were taken to the movies, circus, and sent to summer camps. Of course, maternal love, care, and warmth Emily very much lacked. She often remembered her mother before going to bed, sometimes smiling and sometimes crying. In the orphanage, the girl learned about the surprising truth about herself. It turned out that her mom was not her own. Emily was about 14 years old when she accidentally overheard the conversation of the educators. The women were discussing the difficult fates of children in the hall after the holiday. They'd had a few drinks, relaxed, and their tongues were loose and their guard was down. The educators were sitting on a sofa in the hall. They thought everyone was asleep by now, for about half an hour ago they had been called out. But Emily was on duty that night, which meant cleaning up after everyone else. She was the one the kindergartners were discussing. What's Emily's fate? Sighed Alana, a full woman with huge glasses. One has to think about it. After all, she was left an orphan. They say lightning never strikes twice her partner. A very young girl named Emma shook her head. And something incredible has already happened to Emily. Emily, who was walking nearby, froze and listened. Something very strange was happening. You know, she was dropped off to this woman, right on her doorstep, just like in the Middle Ages, Alana clarified. Apparently someone knew she was dreaming of children, but God wouldn't let her. We're all aware of it here, Emma nodded. Emily is such a beauty. She has so much innate nobility about her. I wonder who her real parents are. Maybe the daughter of some rich people walking around? Got rid of the disgrace. No, objected a colleague. More likely some alcoholics planted her. Who else does that to children? My mom wasn't my own. Emily couldn't hide any longer. She needed to know for sure. The kindergartners were embarrassed by the gossip. But the way back was closed. Emily had heard everything. You would have found out anyway, but later, at graduation, Alana admitted quietly. You were dropped off by your foster mom. And then she died, and you were orphaned again. Don't worry, you're an adult. You'll be back on your feet soon, and it won't matter anymore, Emma encouraged. Do you know anything about my real parents? No, Alana looked at Emily with pity. Your mom didn't even try to find out anything. Probably was glad she had you and was afraid the relatives would take you away. Emily returned to the bedroom. She had learned the truth of her fate. The news seemed like it should have shocked her. But somehow the girl remained calm and even cool-headed. Did it matter whether her mother was her own or not? The main thing was that they were very happy together. The girl had no doubt that her mother loved her. Later, Emily began to think about her real parents. Who are they? What made them give? Up the child. Are they still alive?
Does she look like them? The girl realized that when she grew up, she would definitely try to find them. However, she had no idea where to start looking for them. She had no information about her relatives, except that Cynthia, a close friend of her foster mother, might have known something. Surely they must have shared secrets with each other, but finding Cynthia herself would be difficult. A few more years passed. Emily came of age and left the orphanage. She was given a modest inheritance, simple jewelry of her mother, an old photo album, and the keys to the apartment. The first thing the girl did was to check if the mysterious photo with the bossy woman and her grandmother was still there. I wonder if it was her real grandmother or her adopted grandmother. Probably couldn't tell now.
At first, Emily was in complete shock at the apartment she had received from the state. Of course, she was very frightened by the new neighbors. It was not easy for the girl to adapt in the orphanage. She had friends. Teachers supported her. But now, in her new life, she found herself completely alone. She had to learn everything on her own: cooking, cleaning, paying for utilities. Emily could not get a job as a cook. They would not take her anywhere without experience. So she got a job as a cleaner, cleaning the entrances of apartment buildings. The hard work took a lot of effort, and the pay was low. But there was no choice. She had to live on something and pay the bills. One of Emily's partners, Aunt Susan, once pitied the girl. It is clear why I clean at my age. It is just a part-time job to buy gifts for grandchildren. And you are young, beautiful. Can't you find something better?
If they won't hire you as a cook, Why don't you try a job as a maid in a rich house? They'll hire you for sure. You're as pretty as a picture. And rich people appreciate beauty. Emily decided to take Susan's advice. In the evening, she called several advertisements for maids. She didn't like the first house. The owner was too frank in his scrutiny of the young girl, but the second place attracted her much more. The interview was conducted by a stately grey-haired manager, John. It turned out that the owner of the house is an older woman, but Emily may never meet her, as she is hired to work in the guest houses and on the grounds. The main house has its own staff of servants. When John named the salary, Emily knew she had to get the job. "Thank you for your time," John smiled charmingly, signaling that the conversation was over.
We have a few more candidates today, but I'll be honest, you've made the best impression on me. So wait for the call. I'll probably call you back. John walked Emily the other way. They descended a staircase with carved railings, and the girl had a stunning view of paradise before her. Wooden lounge chairs under umbrellas, slender palm trees, and a huge pool of fancifully shaped turquoise water. On the side of the pool sat a tanned, handsome boy of about 15 with merry eyes, exposing his body to the sun's rays. Emily and a slightly younger girl were lying on a lounge chair by the pool. She was wearing a white swimsuit, emphasizing her stunning tan. Next to her was a guy. They both seemed very nice and handsome to Emily. She couldn't help but admire them. These teenagers lived in a completely different world, unaware of the existence of dysfunctional neighborhoods where children grow up unsupervised while their parents wait for government benefits. Emily sighed, wishing she were in their shoes sunbathing by the pool, swimming in the turquoise water. "These are the landlady's grandchildren," John explained, noticing her interest. "They're well-mannered and good kids. But if you stay to work for us, you need to know this: do not approach the hosts or guests unless necessary. If you are needed, you will be called." Emily nodded. John's words hurt her unpleasantly. She immediately felt like a second-class citizen. However, she really needed this job. If the owners paid her the promised amount, she could save up for a new place to live. Besides, it was so nice to work here, not like scrubbing dirty entrances day after day. That evening, John called back and told her that Emily had been hired. After that, she couldn't sleep for a long time with excitement, making plans for the future. For almost a year now, Emily has been working at the house. She gets up at 6 a.m., goes to the bus stop, takes a long bus ride to the bus terminal, and from there it's a long walk to the owner's house. But she's used to it. The pay is good, the work is not difficult, the conditions are more than excellent, and she is fed heartily in the kitchen. She can be patient. In the course of her work, Emily has made friends with the cooks Kevin and Alex, the janitor Fred, and the young maids Melanie and Roxy. Even John had developed a warm relationship with her. He seemed to pity her as an orphan, though he tried not to show it was out of status. There were servants from the main house, where the mistress herself lived. Emily hardly ever crossed paths with them, as their territories did not touch. She was responsible for order in 4 small guest houses and gazebos, where relatives and acquaintances of the mistress often rested. Guests came all the time, and someone always lived in one of the cabins. Some people showed up regularly, others only once or twice during the whole time. So Emily, Melanie, and Roxy were always busy. Often relatives' grown children, grandchildren came to visit, but they stayed in the main house with their mother and grandmother. This mansion looked like a palace with white walls, monumental look, and luxurious elements of decoration: columns, stucco, winding staircases, huge windows, balconies of bizarre shapes. All this looked solemn and very expensive. Emily never went inside the main house. She was not allowed inside. The servants lived there, whom she hardly knew, but saw only from a distance stern women and trim men in uniforms. They looked down on the rest of the servants. Emily decided that working in the main house was the ultimate privilege with higher salaries. She was interested in looking inside and seeing how things worked, but couldn't. In an entire year, Emily had never once met the landlady in person. Sometimes she saw her from afar, when she was walking to her car or entering the house. But it was rare, and she'd never gotten a good look at her. She was tall, straight as a stick, always beautifully dressed in the summer, wearing her usual wide-brimmed hat and half-face sunglasses. In the cold season, again in a hat with brim, but warm and wearing a black coat. You couldn't see his face behind such a disguise, but Emily had gotten a good look at her hostess's gait. The woman never went down to the pool. Fred explained to the curious Emily that the big house also has a huge pool, with a bridge and even a small waterfall. Emma Susan swims only in it. The girl immediately wanted to see this miracle, but access to the house was closed to her. In the outdoor pool in the summer loved to splash in guests and hostesses, friends, grandchildren, and numerous relatives. At certain hours, the servants were allowed to swim there. Emily never missed an opportunity to take a dip in the clear, cool water. At those moments, she felt like a mermaid and tried not to think about the fact that after all this luxury, she would have to return to her apartment to listen to the neighbors scolding, inhale the unpleasant smells of poverty and desolation, and see the grayness and squalor around her. But she's not the only one. Her new friends Melanie and Roxy, they also have a difficult fate. Melanie was raised by her grandmother from an early age, because the girl never had a father, and Mom started a new life, where the eldest daughter had no place. And Roxy literally ran away from her family. She lived in the village, parents drank, gave birth to children. And it was Roxy who had to look after the whole horde. The girl always dreamed of a better life, and after graduating from school rushed to the city. She planned to go to university, but it didn't work out. But she found a good job, got a job in a rich house. Of course, the girl's servants often discussed their mysterious mistress in their daily work. Maybe she was hiding from everyone because of her terrible scars. Roxy speculated. She loved soap operas and had a vivid imagination. What if her jealous lover poured something on her when she was young? Or they were in a terrible accident together when they were hiding from relatives? Didn't approve of their union. Oh, come on, the practical Melanie waved her hand at her. He just doesn't think we're worthy of his attention. That's why she always passes us by. Are we just bugs to her? Sometimes Fred the janitor joined the conversation. I heard that she had some grief in her life a long time ago. But she still can't get over it. She's our landlady. I heard John talking to the servants in the cottage about it, saying that the mistress is sad today because it's an anniversary, a misfortune. What kind of misfortune? I didn't understand. Through such conversations, the image of the mistress became more and more mysterious and mysterious. Emily wanted to see her up close and personal, but she was never able to do so. One day, John overheard the gossip of the young people. Don't you have enough work to do? Why do you talk with your tongues? Emily and the other young servants were not afraid of him. The strictness of the major of the house was contrived, and the workers themselves worked hard, tried. The salaries were decent, and no one wanted to lose his place. So their work was not to be faulted. But John, as a manager by status, is supposed to remain firm and rigid. Tell us about the landlady, Emily asked bluntly. I wondered why she was so distant, so mysterious. She doesn't go out into the garden. It was a risky request. He could get angry and call the girl a curious barbarian, judging and sticking his nose where it didn't belong. That would have been quite in his nature. But the man suddenly, to the surprise and delight of the three friends, opened up Pamela as a golden person. She's kind, generous, which you couldn't help but notice. She does a lot for her sons and grandchildren. She also helps poor children. That's great, smiled Emily. But why such mystery and detachment? Someone is always coming to see her, and she doesn't talk to anyone but her closest friends. Well, first of all, the mistress is already in years. At your age, you want to have fun and socialize. And people like Pamela and I prefer peace and quiet. Don't be modest, you didn't make eye contact. The house majordomo did. Roxy, you're a big girl. I was, John grinned at her, and continued, but fate is often unfair. There was once in Pamela's life a great sorrow died her only daughter, the youngest and late child. Clever girl, beautiful, the favorite of the whole family. And after all, how sudden and terrible everything happened. The girl flew to study in England, and the plane was in a plane crash. Of course, no one survived. Wow, Melanie couldn't help but sigh. So finish your theories about the mistress to build. You think I can't hear you talking? Scars. Unhappy love. John gave Roxy an expressive look. Well, ever since then, Pamela has been averse to noisy society, socializing and all that. She seldom gives soirees, only on the most solemn occasions. It tires her. She's changed a lot since the tragedy, and now she's getting older. So that's the story. There's nothing mysterious about the landlady. Just an unhappy person. Emily thought long and hard about the majordomo's words. It turns out that you can have all this beauty and still be unhappy. Emily rolled onto her other side again, looking out the window. In the light of the street lamp, night insects were hovering. Crumbs of them were reaching for the light at the upstairs neighbors. Everything seemed to have quieted down. Finally, the girl closed her eyes. Quiet, good calm. Emily didn't notice how she fell into a long-awaited sleep. The morning began, as usual, with the shrill ringing of the alarm clock. She struggled to open her eyelids. She had fallen asleep very late last night. She desperately wanted to spend at least half an hour in bed, but she couldn't because the bus wouldn't wait for her. Emily struggled to get her head off the pillow and walked into the bathroom with her eyes still closed. A cool shower was always invigorating. The girl had a quick breakfast of a sausage sandwich and coffee. Melanie had said that someday the habit of such a breakfast would turn Emily into a fat woman, one who couldn't fit into decent clothes. But so far, the irregular gastronomic habits had had no effect on the girl's figure. Emily pulled on short denim shorts and a long, wide t-shirt, made a high ponytail, put her feet in sneakers, threw her backpack with a swimsuit, phone and purse over her shoulders and left the house. At this hour, all her non-traveling neighbors were usually asleep, resting from the night's adventures. So walking down the road leading to the bus stop was even pleasant. But in the evening, Emily was always a little afraid to come home. She was especially scared of Kevin, the local first guy in the village. He even seemed to be working somewhere in the city, but like all his companions, he managed to drink almost every day, not denying himself the pleasure of having another affair. But everyone knew that Kevin had his eye on Emily. That was what frightened the girl, because if one day Kevin went from trying to get to know her more intimately to taking action, there would be no one to protect her. She was all alone. It would be good to go to work at the central cottage. The servants from there rarely leave the house. They even have a separate wing where they live. I wish Emily could do that too, she thought. And then Emily spent an hour traveling through the city on a half-empty bus. On the next trip, the bus would be crowded with people rushing to work, so that there would be no place for an apple to fall. In the meantime, it was quiet, calm, and peaceful. Emily even had time for a little nap. She opened the servant's gate with her own key and found herself in the garden. It was deafening, dizzying with scents the grass had not yet recovered from the dew. Emily inhaled a full breath and smiled. How nice, beautiful, pleasant, and most importantly, safe. Hi. Alex smiled at her friend. She almost always came before everyone else. She lived nearby. Roxy had already had time to change into her uniform, a strict dress of soft pink color with buttons. Good morning. John is gathering us all at 8:30 in the big gazebo. He has some important announcement. Either about today's guests or something else happened. All right, I'll get changed and I'll be there. This was unusual in Emily's memory. It was the first time the master of the house had organized a general meeting. Usually he gave his orders in person. This was an intrigue. When Emily arrived at the gazebo, everyone was already gathered there, including the almost unfamiliar servants from the main house. Her friends waved her over to join us. They took a seat for her. Well, it looks like we're all here now, John said, looking around at his subordinates. We're good to go. It turned out that in 2 weeks' time the hostess had an anniversary. On this occasion, a big celebration is planned. About 100 guests, invited musicians, artists John listed. In the evening after the concert, fireworks. The event is big and responsible. I want everyone to understand that on this day everything should be at the highest level. It turned out that the efforts of the people at the cottage were not enough to serve the guests. Melanie, Roxy, and Emily, as young, pretty, and quick-witted as they are, were planned to be waitresses. Could we manage? Melanie hesitated. I've never catered a banquet before. Of course you'll be brief, John reassured her. In fact, it's nothing new. You've done the same thing before. It's just a bigger event than usual. Emily remained calm outwardly. But in her heart she was jubilant. She would finally be allowed into the house. She'd wanted to go there for so long. And she would be able to get a good look at her mistress. And the holiday promised to be big. There would be dressed-up guests, musicians, singers. Fireworks are planned. There'll be something to see. From then on, the house was filled with talk of the upcoming celebration. John, as promised, instructed the future waitresses. It turned out nothing complicated. Walk with a tray around the room and watch the guests. If someone makes a sign, go up to that person and offer appetizers or drinks, always with a polite smile. Emily had done something like this several times before at holiday meals. But now, it was much more serious, and the event itself was to be held at the mysterious center cottage. With a slight polite smile, John said indignantly, glaring at Roxy, "Why are you smiling with all 32 teeth? Be softer, calmer, more elegant. Look at your friend." Emily smiled. She was really good at it. John praised her grace and coordination, setting her as an example to others. And remember, he said for the 100th time, don't forget the main rule: no unnecessary talking, glances, or personal contact with guests. You must blend in with the interior, be just an addition to it, not draw attention to yourself. Melanie nodded gravely. "We'll try." "I promise," Roxy said. Closer to the party, the decorators arrived. They decorated the garden with garlands and light fountains, put transparent statues, even built a pond with large fish. As the solemn event approached, Emily became more and more nervous. But her interest grew. One day the servants were brought in to try on a festive uniform for the event. For men, maroon pants and a plaid vest. For women, a vest and skirt of the same shade. Strict business style. "It suits you very well," admired friends, looking at Emily. "You're a real model." Emily smiled. She liked it very much herself. She had never dressed so strictly and businesslike before: jeans, t-shirts, light sundresses. It turns out that the office style really suited her. And now, finally, the long-awaited day had come. The night before, Emily hadn't slept much. The neighbors were walking, then overhead noise, then wandered with laughter and songs under the windows. But it was the excitement that kept her awake the most. All these preparations for the anniversary are behind us. And tomorrow, the culmination. A grandiose celebration. If only everything went smoothly. The next day, the waitress's dress rehearsal was scheduled, and John led the girls into the central cottage for the first time. Emily even felt dizzy at first at how spacious it was. A huge space in which the huge corner sofas and comfortable armchairs were lost. There were long tables along the walls. "Like I said, there's going to be a buffet," John said. Everything was bright, clean, glossy. Emily couldn't stop looking around. Upstairs was a wide staircase with a comfortable banister. What was on the second floor? One could only guess. The room where the banquet was planned didn't look like a living space: beautiful, spacious, but too formal. Emily didn't see any of the little things that could tell something about the hostess's personality: photographs, statuettes, paintings. It was as cold and aloof as Pamela herself. John grinned as he looked at the surprised girls. "What? Impressed? Of course you are, it's so big. That's why I brought you here in advance, so you wouldn't open your mouths in front of the guests," he said. "And in general, whatever you see, keep yourself in control, stay calm. Why does she need such a big house?" Roxy continued to wonder. "And those guest houses, and the huge garden. I don't understand." "It's none of your business," John said, clearly unhappy with her statement. The time before dinner flew by in a flurry of activity and preparation. Then the girls were told to rest, so that they wouldn't be tired in the evening. The friends didn't mind. They settled down in the servants' wing and lay on the sofa until the evening, chatting and watching light serials. Strange sounds came from the garden. It was musicians tuning their instruments. A little later, the artists and singers arrived. People from their team spent a long time fiddling with lighting and electronics, preparing the stage. Time flew by quickly. At 6 p.m., an excited John came in and told the girls to change. "Is it really starting already?" The girls looked at each other with excitement. Emily felt something cold rumbling in her stomach. The guests began to arrive, men in perfectly tailored suits, women in evening gowns. They looked like performers from rich living movies. And though Emily had promised John not to stare, she couldn't help but stare openly at the arrivals: the outfits, the jewelry, the accessories. She'd never seen such splendor in the stores. Obviously, they'd bought their clothes elsewhere. Emily, dazzled by the luxury of the evening, did not even recognize Christina, the granddaughter of the hostess. Usually she dressed like a teenager, but tonight she looked like a princess. Her flowing, long golden dress was beautifully fitted. Her long hair was arranged in an elegant bun. The girl admired the young beauty. "Don't forget why you're here," John whispered softly in her ear. "Why are you three so confused?" Emily pulled herself together and walked slowly down the hall with the tray, just as she'd been trained to do all week. The hostess was here, too. She appeared to be in her 70s. But Pamela didn't look her age: tall, statuesque, in an elegant long gown, with natural makeup and exquisite jewelry. She held herself with dignity, but at the same time she was friendly, smiling at the guests, trying to pay attention to everyone. For some reason, Pamela seemed vaguely familiar to Emily. She even shared it with Melanie. Wow, her friend grinned. You've been working here for a year, and you've seen her many times, even from afar. She should be familiar to you. Oh, I think my name is. But Emily disagreed with Melanie. Yes, she'd seen her landlady in passing, but her face was always hidden by her glasses and hat brim. No, now Emily saw her face for the first time, and it did seem familiar. Strange. One day Emily had walked up close to Pamela as she was talking to a gray-haired man, and he had called a waitress over to take a glass of champagne. Pamela was distracted for a moment, glancing away, and then returned to the conversation. The girl had time to notice a small scar on her hostess's cheek, a small indentation. The evening went on as usual. The guests moved into the garden. There was a stage on which the musicians put on an enchanting show. On the big screen behind their backs appeared amazingly realistic pictures of forest, then mountains, then in general some fantastic landscapes. Some of the artists were unfamiliar to Emily, while others she often saw on the TV screen. Real stars came to congratulate Pamela. Emily could not even imagine how much the celebration had cost the hostess. It didn't fit with John's words that Pamela didn't like noisy society, fuss and so on. Emily asked her husband about it at home during the concert. He, seeing that the party was going well, was in a good mood, and so he answered, however, with some strange phrase, "Kings can do anything." And kings can do anything, the man sang, winking at Emily. She didn't understand. Her position obliged her. What's not to understand? It's a status requirement to throw an anniversary party. That's what they do. I see now. Pamela is tired. She doesn't like it. Can't you tell? Emily glanced at her hostess. She looked energetic and enthusiastic. But perhaps her husband knows her better. He might know better. The guests were having fun, singing along to the artists. Some of them even danced. There were amazingly beautiful light fountains everywhere. Garlands hung by designers turned the garden into a setting for a magical fairy tale. Finally, the concert ended. Pamela's sons, grown, solid men, came on stage and made an insanely moving speech. Emily almost cried and keenly felt her own orphanhood. They were grown-up, established businessmen. They have families and big children themselves. But how much they needed Emma, how much they loved her. You could feel it in every word of these men. Then the guests spoke. They said a lot of nice words about the Jubilee. Alex didn't know what an amazing person her hostess was. It turns out that she is engaged in charity, helps sick children and orphans, supervises several orphanages. Now Alex found out about it. At the end, they prepared a surprise for Pamela, a video about her life with beautiful music. On a huge screen mounted on the stage, photos flashed. At first black and white. On them, Pamela was very young, thin, angular, with a kind of uncertain, timid look, little resembling the powerful woman she was now. Wedding pictures, pictures from work, photos on the doorstep of the maternity ward, family photos where Pamela is surrounded by her family, her husband, 2 boys and a tiny girl. This must be the daughter who died in the plane crash. How sad. Pamela changed, became tougher, more confident. She liked to dress lavishly and flamboyantly. Now she posed in beautiful outfits and massive jewelry, rings, earrings, chains. There was something unpleasant in her eyes. Was it contempt? No, Alex liked the modern Pamela much better. But that middle-aged mistress from the photos reminded Alex desperately of someone. The girl couldn't figure out who. And then she saw her. A familiar picture. From the big screen, Alex was looking at the woman from the picture her mom had once hidden from her. Kind of like her grandmother had loved her. It was so unexpected that the girl dropped her tray. Fortunately, everyone was engrossed in the spectacle. No one even noticed it. The heavy necklace around her neck, the stern look, the mole on her cheek. There was no mistaking it. It was surprising to see a familiar photograph on the big screen. The frame changed. Pamela was rapidly growing up on the screen. Milestones of her life flashed by at high speed. Alex stood thunderstruck. Maybe she was just imagining things. Could it be? Hardly. Now the girl realized who her hostess reminded her of the very woman from the mysterious photo. Except that there was no mole on her cheek now. But in its place there was a scar, a small depression. Alex noticed it as she walked by. Probably Pamela at one point simply got rid of the natural ornament, removed the mole. So what's it look like? Alex works at her grandmother's house. If her mom were alive, she'd answer all the questions. But now we have to find out the truth on our own. And it has to be subtle, not blunt. Then there was a festive fireworks. Multicolored flashes bloomed in the sky. Some of them took fanciful forms: heart, rainbow, stars. Everyone in the garden admired the fireworks. People's faces were looking up, and only Alex was looking solely at Pamela. Her face reflected blue, red, and green reflections. The birthday girl was smiling. Alex scrutinized every feature of her face and realized more and more clearly that yes, this was the woman from the photo. After the party, Alex stayed overnight in the servants' wing. There was no point in going home. The guests had left at midnight, and it was already time to get up. Especially at this hour, it wasn't safe to walk around the neighborhood where Alex lived. Roxy had gone home. She was renting an apartment nearby. Melanie stayed in the outhouse too. The girls made themselves comfortable on the big couch, turned off the light. Tomorrow was going to be a long and laborious day of cleaning. Of course, additional people had been hired, but there was still a lot of work to do. Melanie fell asleep quickly. But Alex, of course, couldn't sleep. What had she seen today? What did it mean? She wanted to share the news with someone. But Alex realized she shouldn't. It became unbearably stuffy. Alex got up and opened the window. Night freshness was blowing from the street. The girl decided to take a little walk in the garden. Maybe she would get tired and fall asleep after all. It was dark in the garden. Lanterns were burning only on the porch of the big cottage. The guest cottages were packed to the brim tonight. Muffled conversations came from there. Apparently Emily had slept well after the party. The girl walked over to the pool, sat down on the edge, and looked at the cottage. Somewhere out there right now, Pamela is asleep or awake, Emily thought. Emily wanted to ask her a lot of questions, but the hostess was practically out of reach. How to approach her? Where to start a conversation? But one thing Emily knew for sure: she would make up her mind. She would find a way to find out. A week had passed since the anniversary. Life went on as usual. Emily went to work every day, ran John's errands, talked to Melanie and Roxy. Only now there was always that mysterious photograph in her pocket. Emily waited for the moment when Pamela would meet. And then Emily would boldly approach her, show her the photograph, and ask the questions that had been nagging at her since the anniversary. But time passed. Pamela sometimes glimpsed somewhere in the distance, then to the parking lot, went to the house. Then a quick step went into the house, or in general appeared not alone, but accompanied by relatives or acquaintances. The right moment never came. It was tormenting Emily. "Emily, you haven't been the same lately," Melanie said one day, pale, anxious. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine." Emily smiled. She didn't want to tell anyone, not even her closest friends, about her story yet. "Maybe you're in love?" Roxy asked with a sly look in her eyes. Emily sighed. If only it were that simple. One day the girl made up her mind. If the mountain does not go to Mohammed, Emily realized it is necessary to act more actively. The moment when Pamela would accidentally get in her way, there might not be. It was early September. The days were sunny and warm. The air was filled with dizzying aromas of blooming herbs. Bright butterflies fluttered. And by evening it was getting crisp. Emily liked this time. She was cleaning the gazebo near the central cottage. Today Pamela's guests were having dinner here, an elderly couple with a little boy, a grandson perhaps. The hostess herself was not with them. Pamela had gone into town on business this morning. Emily now knew that the hostess spent a lot of time on charity, supervising foundations, orphanages, and hospitals. Emily was just checking the wide, long table in the gazebo when she saw them. Pamela and John were walking down the path to the house, talking quietly about something. The hostess, as usual, was wearing a wide-brimmed hat and dark glasses. I couldn't see her face, but her gait, her posture, her figure. No, Emily would never mistake Pamela for anyone else. John gallantly opened the door for the lady. She smiled at him and stepped inside, and the man approached Emily. "Well done," he praised the girl's work. Quick, clean, as always. The man was clearly in a high mood, and he wanted everyone around him to smile. Apparently, the conversation with the hostess had been pleasant. When he left, Emily put the rag aside, glanced around the house, fumbled for the doubled-up photograph in her pocket. Sigh. Now or never, she thought. Emily slowly approached the door, glancing around every now and then. It seemed that John or one of the household servants was about to appear. Of course they would scold her. After all, Emily knew perfectly well that she wasn't allowed to enter this house without permission. It is not her territory. She is not on the staff of the privileged servants whose duties include the upkeep of the cottage. Emily felt like a trespasser, almost a criminal, when she took the doorknob. Still, she took the step and found herself back in the spacious hall. Without the long tables along the walls, it seemed even larger and more spacious than Emily remembered from the anniversary. The girl stood for a few moments, listening to the sounds of the house. From somewhere came the muffled clinking of dishes and voices. It must have been the servants. Here would be the story if one of them came out into the hall and saw her looking around. She would be rudely ushered out the door, complaining about the insolent maid to John. And John? He'll probably fire her for all the good he's done her. Because there are strict rules. They're even spelled out in the employment contract. And Emily was brazenly breaking them right now. The girl sighed. Well, the first step has been taken. We have to go all the way. There was no turning back, and she headed straight for the wide staircase that led to the second floor. The landlady was definitely there. Emily easily ran down the steps and was confused again. A wide hallway, many doors. Where to go? At least there was no one there. Pamela came out to Emily on her own. She came around the corner from somewhere. She was wearing a beautiful homemade suit, satin, or silk oversized black pants, and an elegant tunic to match. There was a flicker of surprise in the landlady's eyes at the sight of the girl. But anger Emily did not notice. You're the girl who looks after the grounds and the guest houses, aren't you? Pamela asked, giving Emily a glance. Her heart thudded with excitement, and her legs felt strangely woozy. But worst of all was her tongue, which didn't want to turn. Yes, Emily finally said. In that case, what are you doing up here? Did John explain the rules to you? Pamela didn't seem angry or accusing. Her tone was neutral and calm. But still, Emily was gripped by panic. The girl slipped her hand into her pocket, fumbled for the photograph again. The feel of the heavy paper in her fingers suddenly gave her confidence. I need to talk to you, the girl blurted out. Pamela's eyes became interested. I guess it wasn't every day that servants came to her with such requests, and there must have been something about Emily's appearance that caught her attention. I suggest you go to my room, Pamela said, and move down the hall. Emily followed her, marveling at her own courage and at how the situation was playing out. The landlady hadn't yelled at her, hadn't called someone to have the brazen intruder kicked out the door. She talks to her calmly, respectfully. And now it's unfathomable. Pamela takes her, the girl in the pink uniform, into her room to listen. Pamela's spacious room had many mirrors, further visualizing the space. Emily took one look at herself, pale, disheveled, anxious. A pitiful sight. Maybe Pamela just felt sorry for her. The woman settled into a chair in front of the round table on molded legs. Emily gestured for her to sit in the chair opposite. Now I'm listening to you very carefully. Apparently you do have something to say. Under Pamela's scrutinizing gaze, Emily was again a little confused. She couldn't think of the right words. The thing is. Where to start? The girl hesitated, feeling pathetic and stupid. And then suddenly she took a photograph out of her pocket and put it in the center of the table. Pamela took the picture in her hands and studied it for a long time. Emily stared at her hostess's face and tried to understand how she felt. But Pamela was perfectly able to keep herself in control. The girl did not see a single emotion. She even experienced despair. Suddenly she felt that in the rollers for the Jubilee was this very photo. Suddenly the owner now will return the photo to her with the question, well, what next? But it turned out differently. Where did you get that picture? Pamela asked. My mother gave it to me. Who's your mom? What's her name? Where is she? The usual mask of coldness and indifference was gradually slipping from her face. Pamela became more and more like an ordinary woman. An amazing metamorphosis. Emily immediately felt more confident. My mom's name was Susan. Well, she was, but she died when I was only 9. Susan, Pamela said thoughtfully. Who would have thought it? Katie. No surprise there. Emily looked at her hostess intently. Pamela's gaze was absent, as if she were thinking somewhere in the past. It was clear that the photograph meant something to her, that there was a connection between them. "That's my mom," Emily jabbed her finger at the skinny girl on the left. "Yes, I remember her well. Jenny served with us for a few years. Good girl, efficient, calm, but I fired her. I was a different person back then. Tell me, who raised you after Jenny was gone?" Pamela asked. "I grew up in an orphanage," Emily answered. Pamela looked at her pityingly, barely holding back tears. Emily saw it perfectly well. "It's my fault. I meant well, and I've done this," Pamela said with strange, incomprehensible words. "I've ruined your life and my daughter's. I'm so sorry for you." Jenny," said Emily firmly. "I heard her talking to a friend of hers once. I understood from it that the woman in the picture was you when you were young." My grandmother, Emily lied, deciding to go all in. She had waited too long for this moment to miss the big question. "I guess so," Pamela nodded, looking at Emily. "The DNA test would clear things up for sure. But it's just a formality. I can see the nose, the eyes, the lip line, an amazing resemblance. Explain everything to me," Emily pleaded. "I don't understand anything at all. I'm even a little scared." "Of course I will," Pamela nodded. "Now we'll have plenty of time to understand and learn. I just can't believe it. We've been looking for you for so long, sending out inquiries, even hiring detectives. And here you are, after all these years, when there's no hope left." Pamela began a long story, speaking quietly, measuredly, calmly, stopping at times and shaking her head in disbelief. She had graduated from the Polytechnic Institute, specializing as an engineer. On assignment, she was sent on an internship in a distant city. It happened often then. Pamela did not mind. She always liked adventure. There, at a large factory, she had met her fate, Tom, despite the youth of the already master, to whom the adult men obeyed. Intelligent, determined, energetic, he immediately attracted Pamela. "I still could not believe my happiness," she shared with Emily. "All the women in the factory were making eyes at him, and he chose me, unremarkable, with this ugly mole on my cheek. How I hated it, how many complexes I had because of it. I got rid of it the first chance I got. Tom made me believe I was beautiful. They got married and got a tiny studio apartment from the factory. But it was better than a hostel. They didn't live poorly, but they had enough. They had enough for food, clothes, entertainment, but they didn't have to be lavish. Soon they had a son. Tom was over the moon. And Pamela dreamed of having a daughter. "I have dreamed of a girl since childhood," she admitted. "I imagined how I would dress her up in beautiful dresses, tie puffy bows. And here is a boy. And what a boy! Our eldest, Jason, from a small age, was a tomboy and a fighter for the truth, a real hurricane." Pamela smiled warmly as she talked about her son's childhood. Emily watched her face with all her eyes. She wasn't used to seeing her mistress so human yet. "All in all, the son turned out wonderful. But I never gave up the dream of having a daughter," Pamela continued. "I was sure that next time I would be lucky. I persuaded my husband to have a second child, but John didn't want to. At first, the apartment is small, the three of us can barely fit. But then he gave in. So the family had another boy instead of the desired daughter." Pamela somehow even calmed down. The third child they would certainly not pull. So such is the fate the mama boys to be. Sons pleased, grew healthy and smart, distinguished. At school they helped at home. I simply adored them and would never trade any of them for a daughter. But looking at moms, walking hand in hand with little princesses, still longed. The dream of having a daughter hasn't gone anywhere. The woman simply drove it into the recesses of her subconscious because she realized that there was no way they could afford a third child. And then came the hard times, those very hungry 90s. The factory went bankrupt. John was left without a job. In the design office where I worked, the wages began to be delayed. Then, of course, they gave me several months' paychecks at once. But not in money, but in coupons to stores where the prices were so high that you couldn't even get near them. It was hard, Pamela recalled. John, a longtime engineer, worked part-time as a loader or janitor. Interrupted small casual earnings because there was no other way out. I knitted to order. Even the boys worked, looking for and handing in bottles, washing cars. And still there was a catastrophic lack of money. But that's how everyone lived then. It was all perceived as commonplace, wasn't it? What's a daughter? I'd rather put my sons on their feet. And then John took a risk. Together with two former colleagues, organized a construction and installation company. All the founders had experience and connections. After all, they had worked at the factory for so many years. At first, things went shakily. The enterprise did not bring money. On the contrary, the last crumbs were pulled out of the family budget. I did not believe in success, admitted Pamela. I scolded John, called him a fool, suggested that he go yard sweeping, instead of spending time on something incomprehensible. He didn't say a word, didn't argue. I can imagine how upset I made him. But my husband is not the kind of man to give up. Soon the business of the novice businessman went uphill. And within a year, the family, from almost beggarly to more than wealthy. We bought a new apartment, a 3-bedroom in a good neighborhood. We got a car. I did not deny myself anything, bought beautiful dresses and shoes, jewelry, said Pamela. All this caused the envy of others, and she simply changed the circle of communication. Even then, everyone who did not have such wealth began to seem to me completely insignificant. And yet I was like that myself not so long ago. Strange, but this fact somehow completely erased from my mind. More on that later. The small firm became a large corporation. John has foreign partners. And that's a whole other level. The family moved to a prestigious cottage community. They got servants in this very house with a pool. Now I didn't have to cook or clean. Hired people did all that. A woman could take care of her children and herself. Wealth spoiled me, Pamela admitted. I couldn't cope with the sudden wealth that came over my head. Engaged, simply put, looked at people who do not have such capital as garbage. Dressed flashily, wearing jewelry, even going on a picnic in the garden. Just like in this picture. It's funny even. I didn't think about children anymore. My condition now allowed it, but age. At that time, women over 35 were already considered beyond reproductive age. And yet, when I realized one day that I was pregnant, I didn't even think about termination. I felt it was a long-awaited daughter. Pamela smiled, looking at Emily. And so it turned out to be. Hannah was born, Mommy and Daddy's joy, the long-awaited princess girl. The boys were all grown up now, and here was a sweet baby again, and a daughter at last, Pamela recalled. She was enjoying motherhood in a new way. Now she had money, for Hannah hired a nanny who took the lion's share of care for the baby. Pamela got only the most pleasant things: walks, outfits, visits to theaters and cafes. Just as she had once dreamed. Even better, because even in her wildest dreams she could not have imagined that she would be able to dress her daughter in such outfits. Hannah grew up in love and total acceptance. She was adored by her parents, her older brothers, and everyone around her. Such an open and pleasant child she was. But favorable appearance not the only thing that nature gifted Hannah. The girl also turned out to be very talented. Since childhood, she drew so that people looked and could not believe that these paintings are the result of the labor of a small child. Hannah first attended an art school, then a prestigious design center. Her parents were not stingy, expensive paints, pencils, additional lessons with the best specialists in the city, anything to make their only daughter's talent flourish and develop. It was at this design center that she met your father. She was just 17 at the time. She was finishing high school. We were planning to send her to study in England, preparing her for it. A dizzying career awaited our girl there. I was sure of it. One day I was late and didn't pick up Hannah from the design center on time, Pamela continued. The girl had to wait for me outside the gate for a while. She could have stayed on the grounds of the center. There are comfortable benches, a cozy fountain. Apparently the girl was just curious to see another life, which she had only heard about. She wanted to see what it was like behind the gates. At the same time, a good-looking guy and his friends were passing by. Seeing a pretty girl, obviously waiting for someone, he stopped and fell behind his own. A conversation ensued between the young people, in the course of which sympathy arose. For Hannah, it was all new, unusual. Like an adventure. Pamela shook her head. We didn't know anything and they started dating. Then it turned out that Hannah was purposely making up extra classes at the design center. I'd take her to it with peace of mind, and she'd run out of the gate and go for a walk with him. In the fall, the boy was taken away to the army. Dating stopped by itself, but by New Year's Eve it became clear that Hannah is expecting a child. I noticed the belly. I had seen it before, but I did not even think about it. How? The girl gained a little weight, it's nothing. And closer to the new year, there is no doubt. I talked to Hannah. She confessed everything. I yelled at my daughter for the first time then. My sons and my husband tried to calm me down, but I kept going on and on. I dreamed so much about my daughter. I had so many plans and hopes for her. A talented girl, an excellent student, ahead of her studies in London. And to ruin her future like that, to embarrass herself and her parents. I couldn't take it. We tried to find this guy's parents so we could give the baby to them. But either Hannah was hiding it from us, or she really didn't know anything about him, except his name. She said it didn't matter to her. They were enjoying their youth, the great weather, each other, and didn't ask each other for passport details. Gradually, a plan matured in my mind. No one was to know that Hannah was expecting a child. Now the girl was not let out of the house, not shown to anyone. I also made a deal with the people at the medical center. For a lot of money, they were to deliver the baby when it was due and then hand the baby over to the orphanage. I planned it well and even calmed down a bit, Pamela continued. But things went wrong. Hannah's labor started early, unexpectedly. The girl was patient to the last in her room, not wanting to draw attention to herself. And when she called for help, I've been a mom 3 times, so I knew perfectly well that the doctors wouldn't get to us in time. Because Hannah was about to give birth, Pamela shook her head. I had to do everything myself with the help of the maid. She was a good, faithful girl, of course. But it was I, Emily, who first held you in my arms. Oh my God. So you think I'm Hannah's daughter? The girl said. I'm sure you do, Pamela nodded. There are many things about you that remind me of her, and your story confirms it. It's going to be hard for me to go on. Try to understand me. I was a terrible person back then, tough, controlling. I didn't realize that money, which by the way I didn't even earn, is no reason to despise others, and energy should be directed to good deeds. I would never do that now. With a tiny baby in her arms, Pamela was confused, and then Hannah started to feel sick. The girl lost consciousness. The woman was afraid for her daughter's life. As long as her girl was all right, the rest does not matter. So the newfound grandmother wrapped the baby in a blanket, handed the girl to the maid, and told her to do what she wanted with her, threw her in an orphanage. Threw her in the woods, as long as not a single thread did not lead to their family. Unfortunately, Fred wasn't home. He would have stopped me. I was scared out of my wits, the maid promised. For a good reward, she carried the infant away and said she'd dropped it off on the orphanage's doorstep. It turned out that no one had been dropped off there that day. She was lying, as I later found out when I realized what I had done and threw everything I had into the search. The night her granddaughter was born, Pamela was only relieved when the infant was carried away. Hannah came to her senses, and the first thing she asked about was her daughter. When she realized she was gone, she threw a tantrum, sobbing, smashing dishes, breaking furniture, venting her emotions. Pamela was then frightened. It seemed to her that her daughter had gone mad, unable to bear the shock. Strong medication prescribed by a doctor saved the situation. Hannah pulled herself together, but became detached, indifferent. She was no longer happy about anything. Even the upcoming study in London, of which she dreamed so much, it was already a completely different person. But I thought I was doing the right thing, Pamela said regretfully. I thought it would be better for everyone, but fate quickly proved me wrong. The next summer, as planned, the whole family saw Hannah off to the airport. The girl was waiting for training with the best specialists and a brilliant career. Pamela was proud of her daughter and herself. After all, she managed to successfully cope with the problem. Thanks to her mother, Hannah started her life with a clean slate. The plane crashed, Pamela said quietly, her face darkening, as if she were reliving the nightmare. No one survived. The only thing Ben said then was if we'd kept the baby, Hannah wouldn't have gotten on that flight. She would have stayed home for a couple more years, taking care of her daughter. I've spent my whole life blaming myself for that. He thought it was our punishment for betraying him. For years, Pamela couldn't find a place for herself. Nothing interested her. Nothing touched her. It was as if the meaning of life had disappeared, and only the marriage of her sons and the birth of grandchildren made her come to her senses. The kids shook me up, brought me to my senses, she said. I realized how much attention and warmth they need, what happiness it is, and I realized that I had to find you, to find Hannah's daughter, my eldest granddaughter. It's the only way I can at least partially redeem myself. And I wanted to see you, to see what you've become, to help you make it in life, after all, just to be there for you. Pamela began her search with the orphanage where a maid, Mariah, had allegedly dropped off a newborn baby. But she quickly found out that the baby had never been there. Mariah was never able to find out the truth. She passed away shortly after the whole story. Pamela didn't give up. She hired the best detectives, searched for information herself. But as the years went by, there were no leads. The woman didn't even want to think that Mariah had done something terrible. Just left the child somewhere in the cold in the woods, so that no one would find it, as she herself had advised her. True, the maid didn't seem like such a cruel person. But who knows? Now I see how it was said, Pamela thoughtfully. Of course you do. Mariah took you to Jennifer. Why didn't I realize that? Jennifer was a single, childless woman who worked in Pamela's house. One day, she ruined her new linens. It was expensive. It was covered in ugly stains because the washing machine malfunctioned. But Pamela didn't want to hear about it at the time. She was still enjoying the sudden wealth that had suddenly fallen on her head, feeling all-powerful. And so she fired Jennifer without remorse. Yes, she was living somewhere in the city, renting an apartment. Pamela nodded. I know she had some health problems that made it impossible for her to have children, even though she wanted them. She knew that very well. So she gave you to her. It was the right thing to do. Logical. She was a good mother to me. Emily's eyes filled with tears. A really good one. And I miss her. I'm grateful to Jennifer for you. I wish I could thank her in person. I also wish Ben had lived to see this moment. It's only 3 years away. How happy would he be now? Grandmother and granddaughter looked at each other in silence. Emily couldn't understand her feelings, a cloud of thoughts swarming in her head. And then Pamela covered Emily's hand with her palm, and the gesture made everything easy to understand. A pleasant warmth spread through Emily's body, and in the soul suddenly began to fill a void that the girl had never known existed before. Everything will be all right now, Pamela smiled. I am so sorry to you, but we'll make up for it. You're not alone now. Yes, Emily nodded. And the tears she had been holding back finally broke through. For the first time in years, she felt needed, loved, and most importantly, loved. It was always covered with a kise, this mirror, like a dead man in the house. If you came very close, you could see your reflection under the light-thin cloth. In general features, but 3 times a year, when the kise was removed to wash it, before New Year's Eve, Easter, and the first day of fall. The woman who did it tried to turn away or lower her eyes, so as not to glance inadvertently at the mirror. Shortly before her grandmother died, Anastasia received a letter from her. Come. The house is yours now. Remember about... And then there was the drawing so familiar, the frame, and of course the mirror. What the hell? Anastasia had no intention of coming before, as her mother had done in her time. She was the first to flee the old house for good, breaking tradition. When the eldest in the family died, the next one took her place. The words home and clan had always been synonymous in their family. The house was built by my great-grandfather to a certain extent. The only important thing is that the house was born in the 18th century, and before it stood in a large village on a hill by the river. Then with time the river became shallow. A dam was built above, and now it was necessary to go down and walk far to the water, and the village was gone, and the town crawled close to the house and was already licking its eyes at the old building, already sending people to buy it for nothing and then tear it down. And don't be such a steely character of grandmother. In a word, all those who rolled their lips had to admit, yes, the monument of culture and the house itself and the garden around it, with arches, arbors, grottos, and fountains, too. Well, the mistress is an old woman, so we just have to wait. Her grandmother knew that she could not bequeath her estate to her daughter. She shivered at the mere memory of the house, with its traditions, silence, and things that gave her goosebumps. She ran away from it, as they say, with lard on her heels. In the end, my grandmother called Anastasia, and she came. She didn't intend to leave Paris, didn't want to return to Russia at all, but everything coincided. Her husband's betrayal, a long and painful divorce, her life shattered into shards, and Anastasia packed her bags. She knew what she was doing. The house demanded a renunciation of everything else. Serving it was becoming the main meaning of life. So in essence, in the state she was in, she had two options: to kill herself, or to stretch the process out over time, to let the house do it. Anastasia chose the latter. But now, 20 years later, she knew that her ministry was over because she had no children, and everything would be over with her. Those who would come here later might want to turn the house into a hotel or a museum, enchanted by its antiquity. The weather vanes on the turrets, the stained glass windows, the carved doors, and the black stone slabs. But the house won't allow it. And when the new owners realize this, having suffered 33 misfortunes, they will simply tear down every last bench, and there would be a wasteland instead of a house, a blank page of sorts. Anastasia hesitated further, though. Maybe the strength of the house is not in itself, but in the place on which it stands, and no matter what they built instead. And then Anastasia had a dream and realized it was too soon to despair. The one she wanted would be here soon. Only the dream was strange. Anastasia wasn't supposed to tell anyone about the new mistress of the house. But even if she did, there was no assurance that life would be as peaceful as before. The house had a premonition of something. It's still vague. That fall, my mother decided that they would winter at the dacha. Mom adored the dacha and the places around it. In general, it was a privileged place. It was a peninsula near the dam, which used to be a real island before it was built. One side were locks, motor ships, barges, yachts. On the other side was the river and the mountains behind it. My mother was once lucky enough to buy a plot of land and a dilapidated house cheaply from a woman who was leaving in a hurry, and she had to get everything done one day. Since then, from early spring to late fall, my mother worked here with enthusiasm. Every spare, and even not quite a spare rubble, went to work. But now there was a 2-story house, and the flowers delighted my soul until the snow came. In November, my mother always said goodbye to the dacha with regret, as if it were a living person. She walked around the house, stroked the walls, patted the door as if it were her own shoulder, and promised that in April there would be a new meeting. And this time she said, "You know what I'm going to do, Maggie? I'm going to winterize this place for you and me." Basically, the idea wasn't so crazy. Mom only needed the internet to work. The cottage had a great stove and several electric goats, so no one would freeze. The only thing was that almost all the dacha owners were leaving, and the store they had here was closed until the next warm season. "It's okay," Mom said. "I'll go grocery shopping once a week on a donkey." Donkey, she called their old car. "Well, you'll have to put up with your girlfriends," my mom continued. "You'll go to daycare for 2 days anyway, and then you'll be sick for 2 weeks. You don't get cold so easily. You're a hardened little man, but all these viruses." So they stayed and wintered well. Maggie didn't even notice the loneliness. It turned out to be happiness not to rush to kindergarten in the morning, but to lie in bed and look at the drawings on the carpet. Her eyes transformed geometric lines into fairy tale characters. Outside the window, it was slowly getting light. The outlines of trees were coming through. My mother was calling for breakfast, and the air was dizzyingly clear. The smell of strong coffee thickened, became palpable. The golden, sunny circles of scrambled eggs my mother sprinkled with green onions that grew on the windowsill, and the slight burning of its taste was a premonition of spring. And on New Year's Eve, the two of them hung twinkling curtains of garlands in the garden, and everything sparkled and shimmered like a fairy tale. But then, as if they had conspired, they turned off the unnecessary light, and then the stars shone brightly in the sky, and the thin sickle of the month promised them riches in the coming year. They only had to show him the silver money. They didn't go inside for a long time, mesmerized by the beauty of nature, and only when they were completely frozen did they come back to sit by the fireplace. Her mother brewed some willow tea, which grew in the neighborhood in summer, and she kept Maggie awake, telling her witch tales for a long time, because New Year's Eve was a special night, and it was not supposed to be the night for sleeping. January, with its many festivities, slipped by, and in February the snow began to drizzle, and Mom made friends with the snow shovel, because otherwise they would have been prisoners of the cottage, unable even to reach the driveway. In March, near the spring, Maggie found the first flowers of the mother nephew, and in April, trouble came. Then they said it had never happened before and would never happen again. An accident at the dam, the one that rose above their peninsula. Dacha dwellers always waited for spring with apprehension. The hydroelectric power plant began to release water, and the amount of water it would release depended on whether it would flood the neighboring small islands, and whether the water would reach the houses and cellars. This rarely happened, and when everything dried up, the dacha owners had to start repairs. It was believed that the dam had a safety margin for generations to come, but no one could have predicted that there would be heavy rains in the upper reaches of the river, and the snow would melt so rapidly, and the hour would come when all the gates would be open, and the water would rush over the top, flooding everything around. The evenings were already long, spring evenings, and Maggie had gotten out of the garden unauthorized. It was a loophole she could not see from the house. She was going to look at the river water always fascinated her, and at this time, when it was swirling and foaming near the dam, when flakes of foam were carried by the current, especially at this time. So at this time she found herself at the water's edge. Perhaps if she had been older and looked to her right, she would have had enough sense to realize what was happening and had a couple of minutes to rush to the higher ground. But she didn't realize, didn't notice, didn't understand. And when the water surrounded her, picked her up and carried her, she was saved only by the fact that she knew how to swim. Of course, in the icy river, she would not have lasted 10 minutes, but next to her was the river's spoils, logs, planks, all sorts of junk, and you cover, maybe from someone's cellar, which became like a raft for her. There could not yet be any help. Those people who had just seen the flood were still recovering or calling any emergency services. And the water was so cold and the wind so scalding, when darkness began to fall before her eyes, Maggie only had time to wonder, could night come so suddenly? She felt sick. It was very hard to breathe. It was as if there was not enough air in the air. Someone's hand lifted her up and held her upright, but Maggie couldn't even hold her head up straight. It kept falling on her chest. "Have a drink," said the woman's soft voice. She tucked pillows under Maggie's back, made her comfortable, and sat down on the edge of the bed herself. "We have to move around a little bit, or we'll get congestion in the lungs. You have to finish this one." Every last drop. It was very difficult, because after each sip, Maggie fell asleep, or more accurately, fell into oblivion. In the end, the woman took pity on her and let her lie down as before and didn't bother anymore. But from that day, the first time Maggie drank from the cup, she began to recover. Now, every now and then she woke up, looking at the objects around her and the woman who came toward her as soon as Maggie opened her eyes. She was tall, very thin, wearing a billowing dark dress. Her hair was combed smoothly into a knot. Her face was so stern that she seemed incapable of smiling. But sometimes she did smile, and when Maggie asked for food, she blossomed. She brought an egg on a little tray, some breadcrumbs, a cup of tea, and she started spoon-feeding Maggie. She put a breadcrumb on the spoon, dipped it in the yolk, and brought it to her. Come on, come on." Maggie felt that her teeth were soft, not even strong enough to chew dry bread. Still, her strength was returning, albeit slowly. The first question Maggie dared to ask, "Well, where's Mom? Where's Mom?" The girl didn't ask, neither what had happened, nor she was now. If her mother were around, none of this would matter. The woman brought her a newspaper. Maggie wanted to say that she could read only a little, and then only when the words were printed in big letters, and preferably those words should be short. But the woman did not suggest that she read. Then she unfolded the paper and showed her the pictures. There were many of them, and one was worse than the other. Maggie didn't recognize her dacha village. It had turned into a garbage dump. Ruined, mangled houses, puddles of water everywhere. "Mom," she asked pitifully. Lemon shook her head. It could only mean one thing. Mommy was gone. 6-year-old Maggie experienced such an acute sense of loneliness that it took her breath away. It was worse than when she was choking on pneumonia. Not only was it hard to breathe, but now she didn't want to live. "My name is Anastasia," the woman said. "You won't be alone, don't be afraid. You will be with me." It was a few more weeks until Maggie began to wander around the house, familiarizing herself with it. At first, she had to cling to the furniture out of weakness, but the faster her strength returned, the farther she traveled, exploring her new possessions. She liked the second floor best, a sunlit corridor with a view of the garden. Maggie opened the doors of the rooms one by one, and in each one she found a treasure. There was a piano, an ancient one, with candelabras and candles. There, a carpet, which was like a painting. A Turk in a turban was looking into a gazebo, where a beautiful girl was lounging on a sofa. Blessed that one of the doors was locked. The key was sticking out, though, and Maggie turned it carefully. She didn't expect to be able to handle the lock at all, but the key turned easily, and Maggie entered the room. It was almost empty. At any rate, the furnishings were most ascetic. A desk over which hung an old black radio, a stiff chair in which it must be very uncomfortable to sit, and Maggie thought it was the bride's veil, white, thin, on the wall. She touched it and heard a warning voice. Don't bother him unnecessarily." The girl recoiled. Instinctively, she realized that she had done something unauthorized and would probably be scolded. The key in the door was there for a reason. Of course, it was not allowed to come in. Still, she couldn't resist asking, "What's in there?" Anastasia lifted the edge of the kersey, turned it slightly away. Maggie saw the carved wooden frame. The wood had long since darkened. The frame was very old. The less you talked to that mirror, the better. Anastasia didn't scold her. Her voice sounded trusting. "Anyway, it'll all be yours later, and you'll understand. In the meantime, don't come in here anymore, okay?" She wasn't ordering, she was asking. And Maggie nodded in agreement. "There's plenty of other rooms in this house to run around in, and walk as much as you like in the garden. But wait here, don't come here." Anastasia locked the door with the key and put it in her pocket. But not once since that day had Maggie even tried to break the ban. When she was older, though, it would have been easy to get to the room, like climbing that tree that grew under the window. But Anastasia didn't go there herself, and so there was nothing particularly interesting to see. The world that existed for Maggie now was limited to the house and the huge garden, surrounded by a high stone fence. She wasn't bored. It really was a whole world. A special man came to tend the garden, and it was always beautiful. Lots of secluded corners where you could hide from prying eyes, if there were any, and a little pond where you could feed the fish in the summer, and a swing, as if it were just for Maggie. Lots of roses, even green ones. The gardener was an old man, and he often stopped work to rest. At such times, Maggie would sit beside him, and he would tell her stories. She was especially fond of animal stories because the gardener gave the animals an almost human mind, and ordinary-seeming incidents turned into real tales. A cow and a pig conspiring to go to a faraway land, a dog performing real feats to save his owners. Maggie's eyes lit up. She would never leave Stephen Swan's side. In the long fall and winter evenings, Anastasia taught the girl various magic tricks. Modern people no longer spend time on this. Magic tricks belong in the circus. But Maggie had deft hands and a sharp memory. They started with different card games, like the simplest one, when one person chose a card and returned it to the deck, and the second had to guess what card is conceived. Then Anastasia started to show how to make an object disappear in your hands. There it was, and it's gone. "There's the mirror for tricks, too," Maggie asked. "You know, the one in the closed room?" "Do you know about the crooked mirrors?" Anastasia asked. Maggie shook her head. She had not had time to see this generally antiquated amusement. Like all girls, she played dolls, and the simplest games on a tablet. "Then I'll show them to you first," Anastasia said. "And then we'll talk about what you want to know." From time to time, they made outings. Anastasia realized that it wasn't entirely safe. What if someone she knew asked her about the girl? Or if someone from Maggie's former life recognized her? The search for those who had died in the flood had long since ended, and Maggie was numbered among them. If it had turned up otherwise, Anastasia would have gone to jail. It wouldn't have saved her from joining the angels if she hadn't pulled her out of the water. But Anastasia took the risk, and every now and then, of going out on the town with the girl, always away from where she lived, always for a little while. And when she and Maggie returned, both of them always felt the strangest feelings. When they opened the gate, it was as if they were stepping from the present into a past where roses bloomed and swings swayed quietly, where the fast, nervous 21st century had no entrance. Anastasia drove a machine that was older than herself. But Maggie was cared for like a living thing, and she still lived, and she drove them leisurely to wherever they wanted to go. This time they went to the park. It was not a work of designer art, but an old amusement park in the suburbs, a kind of excursion. Young people, like birds on perches, sat on the backs of benches, putting their feet on the seats. Along the alleys, the kids were taken on a mini steam train with tiny open cars. There were Devil's Wheel and Daisy and Illusion, in which it seemed that you were turning upside down and the ceiling, which should be at the top, was floating under you. The room of crooked mirrors was not popular and was empty. A full-figured woman, the one checking tickets, was bored beside her. Maggie instinctively sensed that Anastasia attached great importance to mirrors, so she squeezed her older friend's hand tight in the surety. In vain. There was not a single person inside. Sunlight poured through the small windows in the ceiling, and dust flecks danced in it. Mirrors stood in a row, and Maggie moved from one to the other, watching her face and body change as they stretched, widened, and undulated. It was amusing, but no more. Maybe if the boys had been in Maggie's place, they would have laughed and pointed fingers at their supposed ugliness. But it took more than that to make Maggie laugh. The girl turned back to Anastasia and looked up at her, questioning. "It'll make more sense to you now," Anastasia said demurely. "In the meantime, let's go." They spent another hour or so in the park. They rode up on the Ferris wheel. Maggie felt as if the wind that ruled the city could pick her up and carry her as easily as it carried the painted autumn leaves. At an outdoor cafe, they ordered large portions of milkshake, Maggie a strawberry, Anastasia a chocolate. It was fun to dip the straw into the lush foam. In short, it was a wonderful day. And when they got home, Maggie never mentioned the mysterious mirror. In fact, she had forgotten all about it. She had enough to do besides. She was tired and slept so soundly that she didn't seem to move once during the night that she realized in the morning that her back and neck were stiff. However, after breakfast was over, Anastasia told her herself, "Maid despise." Maggie realized what it meant and jumped up eagerly. When they reached the door that she had not opened since that one time, Anastasia unlocked it, took the key out of the keyhole, and put it in her pocket. "I won't lock it again." They stood at the mirror. Anastasia hesitated a little and, lifting the keyhole, threw it over the top of the frame. It was a rather large mirror, allowing me to see myself full length. It was a little tarnished from time, but otherwise it looked quite ordinary. The frame was the only good thing about it, the carvings so finely carved they were uncommon nowadays. A real weave of wooden lace. Maggie hesitated for a moment. She didn't understand why. She began, eventually, but she stopped her. "Look at our reflections," she said. Maggie began to gaze. Of course, her gaze was fixed on herself. After a while, she began to think that the girl reflected in the glass was more beautiful than she was. She had unusually smooth skin, and it was as if she had a slight gold cast to her skin. Maggie's features hadn't changed. It was undeniably her, but there were accents. There was a strength in her gaze that had never been felt before, and her whole appearance had taken on a marvelous harmony. It was hard for Maggie to take her eyes off her reflection. That girl in the glass was so good. She shifted her gaze to Anastasia's reflection and almost gasped. The simple face had turned into a countenance. A thin nose, perfectly shaped eyes, but there was no color in that face. It was waxy. Mirrors would do better if they reflected more. Or thought, Anastasia said thoughtfully. It's a French poet's phrase. It can be translated either way. Now look at this. She stepped back to the desk, where a chocolate-colored plush album lay on the table. Anastasia flipped through the pages and pulled out a photograph of a rather handsome middle-aged man. She turned the picture over so that the mirror would reflect it. A few moments passed and the man's face changed. His cheeks pulled back and sagged slightly, his lips curved, his gaze became different. It was the same man, but now his face was a complete reflection of his character. Overbearing, self-centered, intolerant. "That's my ex-husband," Anastasia explained. "Oh, but how does a mirror do that?" Maggie was amazed. "I don't know." Anastasia replied simply, "In my memory, it's always been there. Maybe it's older than this house. Maybe my great-great-great. I don't know how many times great-great-grandfather brought it from somewhere. But when you look at it, you start to see the real you. You can't hide anything from him. There are no secret movements of the soul for him. And I can't even tell if it will stay that way if you take it out of the house, or if it's the other way around if this place gives it its power. But there are two things you need to know that I will tell you. First of all, you can't take it out in public. It'll all be over at once. People will rush like vultures to investigate it, refute its power. Some will admire it, others will laugh at it, and it won't stand for that. That's why I showed you the crooked mirrors. If someone sees it by your carelessness, try to defend the mirror, say that it's just crooked, a toy for the public, and hide it the first chance you get. Secondly, avoid looking at him too much yourself. The longer you stare at him, the more power will bind you. What will happen to you? It's hard for me to describe. One time when I was looking at the mirror for a long time, it was as if something from it was transmitted to me. After that, when I looked at people, I could read their minds. I thought I was going crazy. I hung up the mirror as before and hardly ever went into that room, and gradually it went away, but it was scary to feel such power. It is not given to man, and he must not trespass on it. Maggie looked around with the directness of a child. And all the things in here are magical, right? The table and the chair. Anastasia grinned slightly. What magic? It's something that really exists, but we can't yet understand it or explain it. The table and chair are just ordinary. Only this, she tapped her finger on the radio, is a funny thing. It looked like a very ordinary, primitive device. Black plastic on the back, and the front part was white, slightly dusty. A frequency scale, a white wheel. I wouldn't turn it on, Anastasia said. Mo, with it, you never know what you might hear. Most of the time, it's just noise interference. If you rotate the dial slowly, you can get to a popular song or news, but sometimes voices begin to sound. Sometimes surprisingly clear, you can even hear the speaker's breathing, as if he approached from the other side and whispers in your ear. Sometimes the voice is distant, and it's not easy to distinguish the words, but it's always people who are no longer in the world. You know, there are things like dreams or warning dreams. This is kind of like that. And you don't just hear it, you have to interpret it correctly. Radio is a thing that should not fall into the wrong hands. Can I? Maggie's lips quivered. Can I hear my mom through him? Anastasia looked at her strangely. Baby, it's never by choice. It's always random. You don't get an answer to your direct question. At least I've never been able to do that. Well, let's give it a try. Maggie was ready to beg. Anastasia sighed and stuck the plug into the socket. Maggie's nerves were so excited that she flinched violently as soon as the receiver came to life and hissed. Anastasia spun the time-darkened wheel slowly, lightly touching it with her index. Weather report, wheezing again, an old song about a truck driver wheezing, whistling noise, some sort of prize draw show, the deliberately animated voice of the host, failure, complete silence, and then a cold voice devoid of any intonation said, Metro. Now, Anastasia was already flinching. I don't think we'll hear anything more today, she said, but Maggie knew she would obey Anastasia and not disturb the mirror again. But if this room was not locked, she would sneak in from time to time and touch the wheel, move it a millimeter at a time, a fraction of a millimeter at a time, hoping that she might hear her own voice, that she might be able to send word, and not once did it happen. At first, Maggie found an opportunity to come here every day, if only for a few minutes. Then, frustrated and disappointed, she opened the door once a week, no more often. Songs replaced the news, sometimes bird song, sometimes a measured noise, as if there were a sea on the other side. And rarely, there were strange, ragged words spoken in a foreign voice. Words that Maggie didn't think had anything to do with her. Eventually, it became a tradition for her to come here 3 times a year. On her birthday, on her mother's birthday, and on the anniversary of the day the water washed away what had been their peninsula, took away all her former life. Not only did Anastasia keep Maggie out of school, she tried to make sure as few people as possible knew the girl lived here. Anastasia started teaching Maggie on her own. She did it responsibly. Textbooks and the internet were helpful. She had to scribble down a lot of penmanship before she developed a beautiful handwriting. How many books had to be read before reading became a necessity for Maggie? She taught her French for fun, and so she wouldn't forget the language, she said. And by the age of 16, Maggie was already fluent in 2 languages, almost mastered the high school curriculum. Oh, math, what a torture you are. Razor blade and the intricacies of gardening were not forgotten in tricks. Here the girl's abilities were undoubted, at least in the circus, to perform. Shortly before her death, Anastasia gave her one last gift. She went down quickly and unexpectedly to everyone. Anastasia had always been thin and never had a blush on her cheeks, but it seemed to Maggie that her older friend was as eternal as this house. She couldn't imagine her life without Anastasia, and the woman had never caught a cold in her memory. How had she gotten pneumonia without ever having been anywhere without freezing? But Anastasia came down with it all at once, in one day, and with the same fidelity as a beast senses the approach of the end, she realized everything about herself. Once a doctor was called to the house for once, and he administered treatment without anticipating a bad outcome, without even talking about a hospital. But Anastasia told Maggie, who was caring for her, "Sit down, I want to have a serious talk with you." Maggie was frightened. She'd seen that look on Anastasia's face only once before she'd taken her to the secret room. She noticed that there were folders on the chair next to the bed. Apparently, the sick woman had somehow made it to the closet where she kept documents and other important papers. "I blame you," Anastasia said. "I raised you like a Mowgli." And I'll tell you, because you can't lie to me anymore, that I did it not so much for you as for myself. I don't know how your life would have turned out, but if you'd been orphaned, I don't think they would have given you to me. There's so much paperwork, a line of people who want to take a child into a family. If I'm orphaned, Maggie repeated slowly, separating one word from the other. Anastasia nodded. I forbade myself to learn anything about the fate of the flood victims. You were sent to me as a sign from above. At least, that's how I understood it. I don't have children, and this house should go from my hands to other loving hands. That's why when you came here, I was as quiet as a mouse under a broomstick, and you and I began to lead such a reclusive life. Tell me, honestly. Anastasia touched the girl's hand with her thin and this time very hot fingers. Have you felt bad with me all these years? But Maggie was in a state of complete confusion. What if her family was alive, and her mom was alive? Was that why she had never heard her mom's voice on the radio of the dead? Anastasia interpreted her silence in her own way. I understand, she said. Just know that I loved you very, very much. Like the daughter I never had. Okay, there's no time for feelings, so let's get down to business. Maggie couldn't help but hear Anastasia's heavy breathing. It was as if the woman was short of breath. Later, Anastasia, she didn't notice that it was the first time she had called her older friend so affectionately. Don't do it now. You don't have the strength to talk. There's no later. Look at this. Anastasia untied the first folder. These are your documents. I paid a lot of money for them, and I don't think anyone will question their authenticity. But if you want to, if life works out that way, you can get real ones someday. In the meantime, here's your passport, which says you're Taylor Maggie, your high school diploma. We're almost through high school. In short, these are the first things you'll need. This is my will, and I give you this house. When I die, it will take effect. Next is a bank card. Don't lose it. It's not a fortune, but it's enough to get you by. There's a PIN code written on the envelope. You must memorize it. And this Anastasia put the last folder in Maggie's hands. This is sort of an emergency airfield, the little apartment where I lived before I got married. Now it's yours. In case something happens to the house, they take it away from you, you'll still have a roof over your head. You don't have to take anything from here then, just two things. You know what they are. Anastasia leaned back on the pillows and took a few minutes, covering her eyes, trying to regain her breath. And not to frighten you, but I must tell you about it too. Don't worry about the funeral. Our gardener will take care of everything. Your business is to enter your rights as an heiress as soon as possible. It shouldn't be too difficult. I have no other relatives. For the first time in Maggie's memory, Anastasia was wrong. At first, however, she didn't care about that. Left alone, she felt a real, great grief, perhaps even greater than when she'd lost her mother as a child. Anastasia had been her whole world, and now that world was dead. Maggie really didn't have to worry about anything herself. All the trouble of the funeral was taken care of by others, both the old gardener and the staff of the bureau. The funeral service was held in the farewell hall. Maggie realized that Anastasia didn't want to let any extra people into the house even after she died. There was a tired, stern face in her coffin, and it seemed to Maggie that now Anastasia was listening to someone to them, the living, invisible, and what he was saying she did not like. To the girl's deep sorrow was joined also anxiety. And when Maggie went back to the house where she had spent most of her life, it seemed vast, desolate, and gloomy, a veritable crypt. Never before had it evoked such associations. Fleshing what Anastasia had feared began almost immediately. Someone was keeping a close eye on the old manor, and they weren't about to let it fall into the hands of a young owner. Red subway came up again. The very first word she had heard on the old radio. The city was about to build new subway lines. In this connection, people living in old houses were decided to be resettled. They said that these buildings would not withstand the underground works. But one could not think that prestigious places in the center would be empty. They would be sold at a triple price. The houses would be demolished and replaced by company offices and shopping centers. The settlers will be sent to the suburbs. They're going to build economy-class high-rises especially for them. And the mansion where Maggie lived fell into one of the new neighborhoods planned for construction. She was a pain in the ass. Maybe there are some states in the world where old houses whose owners don't want to give in to change are left alone, and new freeways circle them, and neighboring huts with futuristic buildings. But this was clearly not the case here, and Maggie began to receive commissions which could not be prevented the more these people behaved in a hostile manner. And the end of land committee inspector, a skinny tall man with a small bird's head of some kind, told Maggie, "You will be compensated." The cadastral value of this house is not very high. He mentioned a ridiculous amount. You can, of course, sue, but you will only lose time. You mean they'll take the house away from me? Maggie asked naively. Her interlocutor shied away from answering. You should look for a new place to live, he said. You realize that the urban development plan has to be fulfilled. Maggie didn't listen any further, but the gardener told her that evening that there were rumors that the authorities had other plans. It's a very nice house. You can't find a house that old nowadays. They'll tell Maggie it's not a cultural monument, or maybe they won't even make any excuses at all. A lonely girl and a quiet, shy one at that is no match for them. And here, it seems, they're going to make a hotel. A river nearby, a small park in the garden. Old windows will be replaced by plastic ones. Maggie even shook her head, imagining this picture. And even before she started the fight, she realized she was going to look. People came every day now. They seemed to have things to do, some to sign, some to clarify. But Maggie knew they wanted to see the inside of the house. Anastasia wouldn't let anyone in to see if there was anything to eat. You won't sell these chairs? Asked the visitor. And the statuettes. A vase. Things a lot. It is unlikely that you will buy yourself such a large apartment to fit in it all the good, and in the antique store to drag foreign troubles. Let's give you a good price right away. Maggie didn't have a shred of commercial savvy, and she still didn't consider herself an antique owner. Anastasia was. There was only one thing Maggie felt responsible for, and that was to remove what was in the secret room. She still hadn't let anyone else in here, though there had been people who wanted to. What have you got in there? Another guest pressed the doorknob seemingly casually. Nothing. My personal belongings, and Maggie touched her fingers to reassure herself, touching the key that was now always in her pocket. And then the guy from the land committee told her that the will was invalid for some reason. So the house would go to the state and Maggie would not be compensated. The girl only looked at him with big, frightened eyes. She was completely defenseless, and the official named Bonds understood it. No. So you can only bring your personal belongings with you, he said. Maggie realized that she might not be allowed to take the mirror out of the house. After all, its frame, its wooden lace, was a work of art, and someone might want it. She ordered a new frame, the simplest, made of pine. When it arrived and the gardener brought it into the room, Maggie would not let him do any more work. I'll do it myself. She stood in the doorway, not realizing that she was like a nurse, that no one was allowed to care for a contagious patient. If there were going to be consequences, it would be for her alone. Maggie walked over to the mirror, sighed deeply, and tugged a cloth off. She'd been at it all night, either consulting the internet or despairing at her own clumsiness. In doing so, she was careful not to even casually glance at the glass itself. The mirror seemed to her to be the judge, from whom it was impossible to hide anything, and she was afraid to see herself with a face contorted with confusion and fear. But it was impossible not to touch the mirror, impossible to move away from it, and Maggie began to feel something happening inside her. Sounds became especially distinct. She could hear a mouse scratching somewhere far away in the house. Ladies, and the colors became clear and bright. The dawn appeared in all its splendor as she stretched out her legs, which were already aching mercilessly. Maggie walked to the window and froze, thinking that she had never seen such beauty. The shimmering colors of the rising sun. The birds singing. Maggie covered her face with her hands. She thought she couldn't stand it all, that she was going crazy, but there was one last thing left. She carefully set aside the disassembled old frame, wrapped the mirror in rough paper, tied it with strings. She hid an unattractive black and white radio in a bag. As she approached the door, she already knew that the gardener was going up to the second floor, and that he was not pleased with the way she had hesitated. That's it, he wondered, looking at what she was about to leave the house with. A wheeled bag with stuff, a small purse with documents, a plastic bag with something, apparently light in weight, and a mirror which no one could touch now. Just an old glass. That's it, Maggie confirmed. Can you please call me a cab? Here's the address. She had never been in the apartment, the keys to which Anastasia had given her not long before the end. Truth be told, Maggie was in such shock that now she didn't care where she lived. She'll stay here, she said to the gardener. You will tell them that I have vacated the house. I am gone. She waved her hands, and again the gesture was helpless. Maggie could easily read the gardener's thoughts. I could take something from here for myself. There's money to be made for antiques. Take it, Maggie said, as a memento of Anastasia. You were good to her, and your garden was so beautiful. She ran down the stairs, leaving the man standing with his mouth ajar as the ride was across town. Maggie settled into the back seat and supported Mirror carefully, like a child. She didn't want the cabbie to help her carry her things in, though he offered. The worst thing was that the apartment was a one-room apartment. I mean, no meters didn't matter to Maggie, but to live with a mirror in one room. Then she saw a built-in closet in the hallway, and with a sigh of relief, she placed her burden there. Didn't even unfold the paper. Then she closed the closet and put a hook on top to make sure. Anastasia hadn't rented the apartment to tenants. No one had been in here in a long time, and the air was stale. It smelled like dust, if dust could have an odor. Or was it Maggie's sensitivity now, like a sheepdog? The girl opened the shutters and only now began to look around. It was the most ordinary apartment, and the current aesthetes would undoubtedly call it murdered. Wallpaper and floral in the room, furniture from the 20th century, a wall unit, and a few crystal vases, a sofa covered with a plaid plate. The kitchen made it especially clear that Anastasia lived here alone. A couple of small pots, a teacup forgotten on the table, a single stool beside a small table. Now her loneliness, like a baton. Anastasia has passed her loneliness to Maggie. The girl went to the window. That's what was fortunate about this house, the place where she stood, on the corner where the boulevard ended and the square began. A fountain with bronze figures of children, and behind it, a theater building, columns, arches, a real palace. I had to start living, everything from scratch. To go to the store and get at least bread, tea, and sugar. Wash the dusty curtains, put things away. But Maggie hesitated, staring at the building that reminded her of a palace. She knew something was about to happen. The feeling was so clear that a chill ran down her spine. She needed to stop being a Robinson at heart, to end the involuntary reclusiveness she'd been living in all these years, to get to grips with all the things she still didn't know, to understand what stores she needed and how she should behave in them, what and where in this big city, how to use transportation. Maggie's situation was worse than that of a foreigner, the one who didn't know the language but understood some general principles, drew parallels. Maggie was perfect, a blank slate, and she didn't have a single familiar soul in this city, only scrappy, vague memories from her childhood of what and how things should be. For she had been very young then, she had just turned 6. Her first forays into the world had been closer to traveling to another planet than walking around town. She found a bakery on the first floor of her house, and that's where she went. Not knowing the value of money, she always bought very sparingly. But there were days when she made do with bread and milk. At moments when she was worried, her appetite was turned off completely. And now she was always shivering because of the abundance of new impressions that life had prepared for her. But almost every evening she found an opportunity to sit by the window. At 7 o'clock the play began in the theater, and on the eve of the performance, cars would arrive. Dressed-up people would rush to the entrance and climb the steps. Maggie had never been to church, but something similar, reverent, she felt, emanated from this palace. And the expression temple of art was unfamiliar to her. And yet, unable to resist what was urging her to go there, she bought the ticket. It was imperative that she should go in with the others. She had not much in the way of outfits. In fact, these modest things could not be called outfits, except for a black silk dress which she rarely wore, and which looked newer than the others. The last time Maggie had worn it had been to Anastasia's funeral. As she arranged her hair into a simple style, she hesitated for a few moments. There was only one mirror in her apartment, a small one in the bathroom. The only thing she could see in it was her face. And even then, in the dim light, and she needed to know what she was like. And Maggie knew who would tell her the truth. She went to the mirror, whose silent presence she had always felt, and lifted the tulle she had draped over it. A thin, almost ethereal girl stared at her inquisitively. She looked like an illustration in a book. The big eyes and the hands, the outline of the head, the neck, exactly like a graphic. Maggie sighed, both convulsed and relieved. She realized why the mirror saw her that way. Subconsciously, she feared that grief, confusion, helplessness had disfigured her soul. She'd already realized by now that it was the soul that the glass reflected. But no, she had not yet found herself in the world, absorbing what she saw, forgetting herself. And the mirror made her look like that, like a stroke of a pen had drawn her now, and still she was good. A quarter of an hour before the performance began, she walked through the doors of the theater, immediately joining the stream of spectators. Never before had there been so many people around. They crowded in the check room, strolled through the foyer. In fact, there was nothing special about this theater that would make it stand out from the others. Stairs to the second floor, and from there, the entrance to the balcony. At the foot of the stairs was a small winter garden and a pond with goldfish. A buffet in the corner. There is music, laughter, and colored lights. Because Maggie had just looked in the mirror, she saw very vividly now, in fragments, as if she were moving from one picture to another. Here was a hand with a crystal glass, a straw rising from the white foam. Here was a fish wagging its tail in the mysterious depths, and the tail was translucent, like a golden plum. The doors of the hall opened. Everything was full of expectation, premonition. Maggie entered timidly, as if she was not sure whether she had the right. The place where the miracle would be performed, she felt it. But it was impossible to fully immerse herself in this impression. She had to find her row, her place. Finally, she sank down into the red velvet chair and froze, hardly breathing. The performance made an overwhelming impression on her. It must have been a long time since anyone cried at an old operetta. Silva had been in this theater for years. But Maggie was mesmerized by the music. Tears came to her eyes, and she was sitting near the stage. And when Silva threw the edge of her bow on her shoulder, a scarlet feather fell into the girl's lap. Maggie clutched it in her fingers in a purely mechanical gesture. Almost from the very beginning, her gaze was fixed on the actor who played the protagonist. Maybe he matched Edwin in years. He was older, but in acting, everything is conditional. Maggie saw a tall, statuesque man with noble features, and how he gave his hand to the heroine. It was tenderness. To the fingertips, the tenderness that makes the heart stop. Maggie had a bad realization that the play was over and she had to go home. She could still hear the music, still be there. And at home, she could think of nothing else but the magical fairy tale unfolding before her eyes. And never before had she had such dreams as she had that first night. From that day on, Maggie became a regular at the theater. There was a ballet and an opera, but she always went only to the operetta, where the poster bore the name of the artist whose image now appeared to her as soon as she closed her eyes. Week after week, month after month, Maggie lived like that. She tried to do things during the day, still bought herself some meager food, looked for a place that would hire her. But things didn't work out, and the people who refused Maggie were understandable. The girl gave the impression of being weird. It was as if she was looking at you, but she saw something of her own, and her lips smiled slightly. The unsure lady asked her bluntly and rudely, "Are you sick?" Maggie shuddered and looked as if she had woken. "No." "What did you say?" "That's the very thing. We have production here, workshop. Everyone has to be attentive, and you're dreaming in some clouds. No, you can't even go to the factory as an apprentice." Maggie realized that the money was running out. Meanwhile, the city was preparing for the new year, dressed in sparkling garlands, and the words "Happy New Year" could be heard more and more often. It was only a couple days before the holiday when the frost hit. What a frost! You couldn't run from store to store, your fingers were glazed, and it seemed like they were going to break off like icicles. And it was necessary that, taking her jacket in the check room after the performance, Maggie heard the two girls in front of her discussing whether it was worth waiting at the exit to ask for an autograph or whether it was too cold and better to go straight home. Eventually, they decided to wait, and Maggie realized she would join them. She didn't need an autograph, but to see the man she thought about day and night beside her, oh, that would be a precious gift. They came out of the theater, and the frost immediately burned their cheeks. Everything around them was as bright as it is when the thermometer drops below -30. The headlights of the cars, the lights of the advertisements, the lanterns, the Christmas tree in the square, the stars in the sky. The sharp rays of light crashed and poured in from everywhere. Maggie's eyes were watering, but she was afraid to blink, lest her eyelashes stick together from the frost. The girls wore fur coats and warm gloves, and she wore a jacket with fish fur and a knitted cap. And yet, bored and cold, they were ready to leave, and she mentally asked them to wait because alone, without them, would not dare to approach the artist. Her sacrifice was endless. She was ready to stand like that all night long. The second wave. The audience had long since dispersed, began to leave the theater, those who had taken part in the performance. Maggie was afraid of not recognizing them, of missing out. All her hope was in these girls. Maggie knew that they were waiting for the same person, and so the girls hurried towards someone, slipping. The granite slabs in front of the theater were icy. Taylor did not come out alone. He was accompanied by a short, stout man wearing a gray coat and an Ushanka hat. Evans. Maggie heard the young voices. The girls surrounded the artist, slipping him programs, their heads close together. Taylor wrote something and complained that the ink in the pen froze in the cold. Maggie moved closer, forgetting everything as she listened to his voice. And then the girls, laughing and thankful, hurried to the bus stop. It was a stone's throw away, and the artist looked at Maggie. "Baby, what do you want?" An autograph, from excitement. And the fact that she was freezing, Maggie couldn't even utter a word. Taylor's companion was also looking at the girl. He was about 45 years old. Plain, unimpressive face. The artist had gotten serious. "Baby, you got someplace to go?" Maggie could have pointed to her house across the square, not 2 steps, but 1.5 steps. But she was shivering like a puppy. She would have been shivering like that if it had been a hot summer. It was all about who was talking to her. The men looked at each other. "We'll go with us," said Evans, concerned and yet very gently. "At least you'll have a warm night's sleep. You'll be cold here by morning, child." Later, Maggie learned that there was nothing surprising in the artist's behavior. He came from a theatrical family. His father also played, and his name was known. And do not count how many families have survived the tour, semi-poor conditions, sometimes lived in poor hotels, and Mom Evans took care of young artists, as if, and really was their mother. She took care of dinner, took care of things. Long ago there was no mom in the world, but Taylor remained her favorite son. And in an instant, the seemingly forgotten was resurrected, and he acted the way she would have acted. It turned out that the companion was an old friend of his, a journalist, and both of them were glad to meet each other. It was warm in the car. Maggie settled into the back seat and listened to their conversation, not really getting into it and not really believing what was going on. Taylor lived in one of the old houses on the same boulevard that had become the local arbit 30 years ago. In the 90s, the tenants of the apartments on the first floor had been forced to move out, some by kindness, some by threats, and now it was all small. And the boulevard was decorated before New Year's Eve as beautifully as any street in the city, and the lanterns created an illusion of the 19th century, and the imagination could easily conjure up horses, carriages, ladies in long dresses and furs. "Evans, do not start any variety. I have an ulcer," said the journalist. And our guest should be poured hot tea by all means." Maggie sat in the big room on the couch and put her hands between her knees, trying to keep warm at the same time, and to make sure no one saw her fingers shaking. Evans, what a hostess, took his time sacredly making tea and, "Sit down, don't help me," cutting cheese and sausage. If the journalist didn't want to eat, the girl was undoubtedly hungry and needed to be fed. She looked so exhausted. He filled her plate himself, poured tea into a large mug. The men talked for a while. Maybe they wanted to give Maggie a chance to come to her senses, or maybe they'd gotten carried away and forgotten about her. Maggie caught bits and pieces of phrases. They talked about new plays, about some famous guitarists who were passing through their town. Evans wanted to hear them, but he didn't have to. "And I sat in their hotel room all night," said the journalist. "Vincent got carried away and played one thing after another." "No, tell me why you came to me," Evans said suddenly to Maggie, and she, who all these months had not told anyone anything about herself, really began to tell, rambling, confused, sometimes stopping for a long time, choosing words, then finding them, then not finding them. She didn't hide the fact that she'd grown up in the old house that was the stuff of legends. Blushing slightly, she said that Anastasia was a distant relative who had replaced everything for her. Her friends, her classmates. But now Anastasia was gone, and Maggie had no joy left but to live an illusion. Evening after evening to forget about everything while the performance is going on and you can drown in this music, live, breathe it. And Maggie does not need anything else. Well, and she has no work yet, although it was not worth mentioning it at all. It is only hers, Maggie's problems. When she stopped talking, Taylor looked at his friend. A movement of his eyebrows. "What's up, Thomas? You know what occurred to me." Even said, "My sister-in-law and I don't get along very well, but as they say, we observe politeness. We try to do each other favors. She has her own beauty salon, and there, as far as I know, there's a turnover. It's not about the salary. The lady's character is very bitchy. But for the first time, don't you want to try? I'll write her a note. It's impossible to reach her on the phone. There are conversations going on all day long. Try it, girl, and then we'll think of something else. And every time I hope that you will say that Ilan is yours, divorced. said the journalist. I always thought that Leia on the 10th husband will not stop. She will go head over heels, climbing higher and higher. Then will be the end of the road for her. I don't know who will be able to find a common language with this bitch. Still, Maggie waited a few days, didn't go anywhere, didn't inquire about a job, gathered her courage. The New Year's holidays helped her too. Everything was closed everywhere you looked. And then the money ran out completely and irrevocably. She couldn't ask for alms, could she? She found out the address of the beauty parlor and went. Maggie always walked now, even if the ends were large. She told herself that this way she would get to know the city, which was still unfamiliar to her. And there was nothing else to do but sit at home. On the way, she convinced herself to hold firm. The worst that could happen is that she would be rejected, but life didn't end there either. Then she would look for something else. Besides, she had a note from an old artist. Evan seemed such a deity to her that she could not imagine who could refuse him. But she found it amusing that he was Taylor, and she was Taylor by her new surname. It was like a roll call in space. Or maybe Anastasia, sensing something, had chosen that name for her. Maggie encouraged herself. But when she saw the modern two-story building, she was afraid again. It looked like an expensive and very large cube, the kind of thing a giant might play with. She glanced once more at the address she had written down on the paper, hoping that it was a different house. No, it was a beauty parlor. Maggie sighed, clenched her hands into fists, and started up the steps. The door opened in front of her, sending a wave of warm air through it. Maggie walked in and froze, not knowing where to go next, who to turn to. At the reception desk sat a girl, very young, pretty, in a uniform green robe. She said hello and asked if Maggie had an appointment, and if so, who did she have an appointment with? I'm about the job. Maggie had to cough and repeat the phrase. A second girl came up to the receptionist, white, tall, statuesque, her hair in a ponytail. Judging by her robe, she worked here too. She was obviously going to say something, but when she heard Maggie's words, she just snorted. And the receptionist was still trying to remain polite. What did you want to be? Do you have some kind of education? Maybe you're a beautician, a hairdresser, manicurist, anything. Maggie felt a pleading note in her voice. No, I didn't go to just high school. Me, she wants to be a cleaning lady, explained the redhead with a ponytail to her coworker. No, I don't think we have any. The receptionist began. Girl, said the redhead contemptuously, you should start somewhere else. Like waving a rag at the train station. Here you have to fit in, you know, like came to us and transformed. Clients shouldn't see people like that from the street, you know? Don't you look after yourselves at all? Maggie was so hurt, so confused, that she didn't even think of running away and slamming the door. But slamming the sliding door wouldn't have worked anyway. But then another woman entered the lobby, and Maggie immediately felt both women pull up. It was impossible to ignore her, and Maggie couldn't take her eyes off her for a few seconds either. The woman was young, short in stature, but with a regal posture. Her black dress emphasized the whiteness of her skin, and her hair, also black, fell in waves over her shoulders. Her lips, painted with bright red lipstick, were striking. The woman looked like an actress from an old movie. Or maybe she was just looking like Dita Von Teese. Island Bush, the redhead with the ponytail, began. Maggie realized that before her was the owner of the salon, the same Leia with a bitchy character. The girls obviously wanted the scene with Maggie did not attract the attention of the boss, but she was already looking at Maggie and raised her thin eyebrows, waiting for an explanation. Maggie didn't have to look for the note, all the while clutching it in her pocket. And this is probably for you. She held out a piece of paper. Island Bush unfolded the piece of paper, took one look at it. Her expression didn't change, and she seemed to make decisions quickly. Now you going to be a cleaner? She asked. You have no education, and we have no other vacancies. Maggie nodded hastily. You can go out tomorrow. At 8 o'clock, you'll come with your documents to Kate. She nodded at the receptionist. She'll show you what to do. Aileen Bush crossed the lobby with a swift step. There was business waiting for her somewhere out there in the parlor offices. The girls were silent. Maggie nodded awkwardly at them, but there was still silence in the hall when she went outside. It is wrong to think that the work of a cleaner is the easiest. Anyone can do it, and that it doesn't take much skill to wag a rag. In the first days, Maggie was afraid that she would be kicked out with a bang. There was so much to remember, so many little things not to miss. After all, she had seen all these jars with cleaning and disinfecting agents for the first time. And now every day she had to do like a general cleaning in offices, halls, toilets, and not a speck of dust, not a speck of dust. Perhaps she worked harder than she really needed to. She stayed when everyone had long since gone home, and before she left, she would go over the surfaces with a white handkerchief to see if it was clean. One time she was even pitied by an elderly security guard. "You live far away," he told her. "Where are you going to go across town now? You don't have money for a cab yet, I know. Lie down here on any sofa and sleep till morning." But Maggie looked at him with such frightened eyes that he just waved his hand and said, "Do as you please." And she was afraid of any arbitrariness, any violation of the rules, in case she was about to be pointed at the door. She saw her first job as the only one in the world. She had no idea where she would go if she was chased out of here. The salon soon stopped noticing her. She was so mute, wouldn't say a word. She never objects to anyone. She nods and does as she's told. "Girls, we have a cleaner, some kind of patient, Nora," W.I. said to her coworkers, red-haired Laura. "Well, the one from the fairy tale about Morozko. She's actually Maggie," the hairdresser objected. "Well then, Maggie's patient. Before her, it seems. No one here with a mop and a rag could hold out for long. The salary is 3 pennies, but our loca asks for a lot. Let's see how long this one lasts." However, Laura immediately forgot about the cleaning lady. In her opinion, she was not worth even a mop. Maggie kept her eyes on her. She especially liked to watch the makeup artist at work, though she only did it surreptitiously. Sometimes, as Maggie walked by, an unassuming middle-aged woman would sit in the chair. And then Maggie would meet her in the lobby when the client was getting dressed, and the girl couldn't help but notice how much better looking she was, as if she had partially regained her younger years. And there was a sparkle in her eyes, and one day Maggie couldn't take it anymore. When she was cleaning Camelia's makeup artist's office in the late afternoon, she sat down in the chair herself, touched her eyes with a brush, then her eyelids, touched her eyelashes with mascara and her lips with lipstick, and stared at her transformed face for a long time. The next day, no one noticed her imposture, and since then Maggie had occasionally allowed herself to steal. When there was no one else in the salon but her, she painted her new image. She had only glimpsed Camelina's work, but she tried to imitate it, and she couldn't believe herself. She was becoming completely different. Mature and very beautiful, she was now coming home so tired that the only strength left was to take a shower, drink tea, and sleep. The mirror hung like that, covered in a dull haze. Sometimes, if Maggie woke in the night, she thought she saw someone in white standing in the corner. She was startled for a moment, then remembered what was in front of her and closed her eyes again. Once, when she thought her makeup came out particularly well, she dared to lift the cloth and look at herself, and she shuddered violently. There, in the looking glass, she was exactly as she had been before, very young, without any makeup. Just a girl of 18, thin, with big frightened eyes. But the room behind her was not reflected, as if it were not there at all. It was just darkness. It frightened Maggie, and she hastily put the towel back and stepped back with a pounding heart. There was no reason, though, no reason at all. The salary, which the girls scornfully called 3 pennies, was enough for now. At work, Maggie immediately changed into her uniform and stayed in it all day. Work and home, she never went anywhere else, and she had nothing to spend her money on. She had not yet seen for herself the temptations of the big stores, and now there was no energy left for the theater. Surprisingly, after Evans had talked to her, she was no longer as eager to go to plays as she had been when she had breathed them. Maggie knew now that she had been given something more. She could call Taylor. He'd given her his phone number and talk to him, to himself, not stare silently out of the auditorium at his character, like not just her, but the entire audience. No, she hadn't dialed his number, but she had it, which meant that at any moment she could pick up her cell phone, and already that made her feel happy. She spoke to him mentally, and for now that was enough to say that evening. She didn't realize that Aileen Bush had stayed in her office. Maggie was about to finish her work when she heard someone enter the lobby. The guard said hello and was answered by a male voice. Surprisingly, the visitor, who had come in at an odd time when none of the masters were present, was not asked to leave. The visitor walked down the hall toward the office where Maggie was finishing mopping the floor. The girl hurriedly bent over. The partition separating her from the corridor was made of glass, and Maggie saw a young man in a light-colored coat with pleasant and somehow familiar features. "Good evening," he began, and where they looked at each other. Maggie was a little confused, wondering if she would be guilty of something. The young man looked as if he were enchanted. Working this late. He didn't know what to say, and it was obvious he'd said the banal words just to avoid being impolite. And you were looking for, and immediately she realized who was in front of her. This is what Evans might have looked like when he was younger. "So it's Eileen Bush's husband," Maggie said what she didn't doubt. "No, she's probably long gone. And if you see your father, please thank him for me." "But we agreed to meet here," said the young man, "and you are the girl my father told me about," so he hadn't forgotten about her yet. And Maggie's lips trembled. She was trying to hold back a smile, so they looked at each other and smiled. "Well, I guess if it was about a tramp freezing outside the theater, that's me." About me, heels tapped on the stairs. Eileen Bush was coming down. One glance at Maggie was enough for her to notice and appreciate her makeup, and to understand its origin. "You'll put $3,000 in the cash register tomorrow." She had been addressing the girl as you for a long time. "If you touch the cosmetics again, you'll be fired." Maggie turned away hastily to hide her flaming face. She knew she wouldn't reach for the jars and boxes on Camelia's table again. Wouldn't even look at them. She'd gotten herself in trouble after all. "Nolia." The young man began with a soft reproachfulness. Maggie remembered his name, Erlan. Elon Smith. But Eileen Bush did not wish to pay any more attention to this episode. She talked about her own business, about some accounts, and was the first to head for the door. Eileen Smith, with a guilty glance at Maggie, followed when the girl was alone. The guard in the lobby was not to be counted. It seemed to her that her strength had run out all at once. She didn't think she had enough to finish cleaning. She sat hunched over on a bench in the hallway for a while, and then she scrubbed the floors. And then she literally walked home. It was snowing, beautiful big flakes. There was no wind, and the snow was falling so slowly that it looked like a curtain connecting heaven and earth. I wanted to sit down and not go anywhere else. And for some reason I wanted to cry. No matter how tired Maggie was that night, she could hardly sleep. She shuffled back and forth on the narrow, hard bed, desperate to get up and not even doze off yet. She got up, dripping valerian, the only medicine she had, and then anger replaced the sadness that brought tears to her eyes. So rather, a stray thought struck her, but it won't come true. It probably won't come true. Maggie ran to the bathroom, took a small mirror off the wall, breathed on it, and wiped it thoroughly. Then, holding it in her hands, she held it up to the larger mirror. After all, she herself, looking for a while into the magic glass, is charged with its power, then maybe, and the ordinary mirror will take over her, at least for a while. Maggie stood like that for a few minutes, and then looked in the small mirror. It worked. The same reflection was looking back at her as in the big mirror. Maggie knew that soon enough it would all be over, that the cheap glass would be left to itself, but she hoped what she had planned would succeed, and who would be able to expose her in that case? That evening, as she finished her work, Maggie didn't think about the makeup or Camellia. None of it interested her anymore. She left the landlady's office for last. She left, taking from Eileen Bush's desk a small mirror on a stand, an expensive Italian mirror that was always on the salon owner's desk. Maggie left the mirrors to talk to each other overnight, and in the morning, as she tucked her mistress's piece into her purse, she felt that it seemed heavier. Maggie arrived at the parlor before anyone else and managed to put the mirror back in its place unnoticed. She closed the office and hurried downstairs to her den, to the rags, the brushes, the vacuum cleaner. She recognized her boss's footsteps immediately. Only Eileen Bush wore such high heels to work. There were voices in the corridor, girls greeting the mistress. She answered them. There was Eileen coming up the stairs. For a while, silence. But Maggie was now as if she were all sharpened to hear. Her hearing was suddenly so sharp that she marveled at herself, and she heard it, that suppressed, horrified shriek. Maggie couldn't help herself, opening the door to the stairs. She knew she couldn't go into her boss's office. She knew she couldn't go into the supervisor's office unless she really shouted enough for everyone to hear, and then she could go in with the crowd. But it was impossible not to find out what had happened. Maggie had barely made it to the second floor when there were false footsteps. Maybe that's how zombies walk. Dumb pause. Dumb, 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 pawn, pause, dumb. The office door opened, and Eileen Bush appeared on the threshold. Her eyes were halting. She was groping her face and looked absolutely stunned. No way, no how. She had discovered a fatal disease. And she ran like a girl to the end of the hall. Maggie realized where she was going. There was another mirror hanging in the bathroom. She couldn't know what her superior saw, but she could clearly picture it. The fixed round eyes of a bird of prey, the leathery skull, the disheveled hair, a wicked grotesque of what she thought was the most beautiful thing in the world. And after all, Eileen Bush, when the first acute impression is past and she is convinced that she has not lost face, she will not even be able to arrange a reprimand to the girls. No one brought anything to her office. Just her favorite mirror, which stands in the same place, played a cruel joke. Maggie was cleaning as if nothing had happened when the female employees began to whisper that the boss felt unwell, called a cab, and went home. I couldn't even drive myself, can you believe it? God, maybe she'll take a sick leave at least once in 100 years. Will at least rest without that vulture, was heard from all sides. You can't wish for bad things, it'll come back to you. Let's wish her a trip around the world for about 3 years, to steady her nerves and ours. The girls loved Eileen Bush. I'll tell you that. In the evening, when Maggie was finishing cleaning, Erlan arrived unexpectedly. She flinched when he opened the door. What did he want here? His visit seemed to be nothing but trouble. Now she knew for sure that he hadn't come for his wife. Eileen Bush hadn't been here since this morning. Yes, in Ireland. As soon as he saw her, Maggie took his hat off his head and went to her with the sweetest smile. I wanted to apologize for yesterday, he said. I know that Leah can behave very unpleasantly to others, but maybe it's the laws of business to be tough. Otherwise, you can't reach the heights. I realize it's no consolation to you, but let me at least compensate you for what you had to spend because of my wife. You haven't done anything wrong. I understand, a young, beautiful girl. It's impossible to resist emphasizing her beauty. Len took some bills out of his wallet. Maggie recognized them. They were red $5,000 bills, and placed them on the dressing table. Maggie's eyebrows flew up. This is for you. A little more for moral damages, as the lawyers say. Maybe you'd like to buy yourself some perfume or something, some trifle. I'd be very glad to know that you've forgiven this unpleasant episode and are not angry. I'm still not taking it. How's Evans? The first phrase came out in a shorthand, the second eagerly. Every piece of news about Taylor, even in passing, was precious to Maggie. No, Father. Rowan apparently didn't know how to switch so quickly. I've seen him for quite some time. We mostly talk on the phone. He seems to be doing well. Playing. Maggie sincerely could not understand how, having all the opportunities to be near such a man, and she did not see Taylor's equal now, one could not value it. Exchange it for something else. For talking with Island for some TV or club. Time was running out, and you could never make up for what you had wasted so ineffectively. At the same time, she felt that Erlan was talking to her in a special way, with unusual interest. The girls at the salon would have said hitting it off, but knew how indifferent she was to all this. It happens. Both are young, good-looking, and one of the parties makes every effort to sow some kind of spark, but in vain. There's no fire, not even a small one, not even the light of a candle. Take it, please, Maggie said, gently placing the bills in Irish's hand and squeezing his fingers. And don't torture yourself. I'm not angry. I really am. Taylor got married very early, while still a student in the vocal arts department. He was considered one of the best there, but he knew he was unlikely to see the capital stage, unless a miracle happened and he was invited. From other future singers, Evans differed unprecedented for actors' modesty. He realized that his voice was good but not unique, and he was categorically incapable of chewing his way out of a seat. Therefore, he had no doubt that if anyone would make it to the big stage, it would be less talented, but certainly more self-confident guys. All right, let it be a provincial theater, as long as he was given the ones he dreamed of. In his senior year, he was already involved in performances at the local opera and ballet theater. And there he saw her, Lara, a future ballerina who had the most beautiful legs in the world. He was coming up the stairs, and she was coming down to meet him, to go to her wing, which was the classrooms where the students of the choreographic school were engaged. He saw her singing feet, as he called them afterward, and could not take his eyes off them. He began to look for an opportunity to meet her, but she seemed to be avoiding him. She didn't answer the notes he passed with the other guys, the ones who were braver. And when he got her number and tried to call her, she wouldn't answer his calls. Her conversations can please. No, I hate being looked at like a circus horse. I saw where you were looking and what you were looking at. But that's the first impression, he excused himself. I saw the face and the soul. Only a little later it was when they were both involved in the same play, and he put all the flowers he got. and he was playing the main character and the bouquets didn't fit in his hands. At her feet, when they married, his teacher jokingly rebuked him for putting a cross on his future. If you're married, you'll lose half the interest, if not most of it. Why don't you want to keep the audience intrigued for longer? Look at the characters you play. Can you remember a single play that starts with a happy wedding? That's the finale, and that's where you've chosen to start. But Taylor didn't care what anyone thought of it. He knew that he had met the only woman in his life, that he was a one-woman man, and that it was fate. But it turned out that Laura didn't think so at all. As it turned out later, Laura was attracted by the prospect, a young, handsome, talented artist from a famous family. Laura was still very young and thought that fame and a well-to-do life would come with the package. But then everything went wrong. Ireland was born, and immediately, he and his father were to blame for everything. Lara suffered at once. Figure, career, and ego. Her to return to the former form could not manage. In the theater, she was not expected at all. Unlike her husband, she was still only a corps de ballet, where no one would notice her absence. And to sit in the apartment, so simple, ordinary, to do the usual household chores, Lara shuddered. She was always acutely aware of how short a woman's life was. And a missed day was like a missed year to her. A year of tantrums, hand-wringing one nanny, another, and the old freedom doesn't come back and no roles are given. And how sickening it is to stand over pots and take up the mop. Eventually, Laura ran away. Island was not yet 5 years old when she left her son with the nanny, a note to her husband, and disappeared so suddenly that if it hadn't been for the note, a manhunt would have been launched. Laura found herself much later. In the capital, somewhere there, she settled in theater circles, quite possibly not as a dancer, but as some kind of administrator. The main thing, in the art and in the right circles, that she is going to remarry. Evans learned when his wife asked for a divorce. But who became her next companion, and what ended her struggle with everyday life? This was not even rumored. Taylor, on the other hand, continued to consider himself a one-woman man. He saw nothing good in it. Rather, he thought of it bitterly as ugly. Take, for example, those dogs who pine for years and wait for their master's return. If the whole canine species were like that, it would be extinct. We need to shake things up and get back on track, but Taylor couldn't. He found a nice older woman who cared for Igor like a grandmother, and she settled into his home for many years, gradually becoming a member of the family from a nanny, a theater, and a son. That's all Taylor's life was made of after Laura left. But the longer time went on, the more friends he made. His sincerity and charm, the complete absence of star disease, care for others, and the aura of great talent, which could not help but feel. All this made it so that people were drawn to him, and a certain circle was formed. Undoubtedly, Evans hoped that his son would be his main friend when Ireland grew up, but the young man almost repeated his own fate. He married very early in a frank bitch, except that neither theater nor talent Ireland had, and God knows what kept his soul. Taylor could not find out. Leah was doing her best to limit communication between father and son, fearing bad influence, that Erlan would ask for freedom, but there were others. The same Thomas Adams, who also lost a son, only hopelessly the boy died. Thomas also reached out to Taylor for comfort. People of different professions and different characters in the house of the artist found that place where material things remained behind the threshold, and only what was valued in childhood and youth. Kindness, nobility, dreams, matters. Soren said that Taylor has his own mafia. Remember the Godfather, Evans? Don Corleone solved all his cases through friends, acquaintances, relatives. Only most people owed him something and paid the debt. You too. No matter what you have, whether you get sick, whether you need help, you'll find everything you need from your friends. But your mafia is not based on fear and duty, but on love. Maggie was one of the first to notice him when he came in again, but she hoped sincerely that he was not here to see her. She was in her office, and the salon was full of customers, but she was not going to be complimented by Iwan Smith in this atmosphere, or to be handed that unfortunate money again. Nevertheless, it was to her that Ireland headed. "Please," Maggie said, "I told you. You don't have to give me anything back. It's really my fault. So it's a normal fine." "I'm not here for that at all." Ireland looked very tired and gaunt. "Father is ill. Can't you be his nurse for a few weeks?" he asked. "If you can." Of course, Maggie's voice was clear. She was ready to go right now without even putting on her jacket. "I don't care if she loses her job. What about him?" An intermittent sigh. There was no play in Irish's gaze now, only anxiety. and Maggie was looking at him just as anxiously. Doctors are diagnosing pneumonia. For now. You know what could happen with that diagnosis. Anyway, there's no way to know yet. There's a doctor there every day. A nurse comes in to give shots. But you need someone to be with you at all times. Are you on the machine? Maggie asked. God, what a fee. What are you talking about? Don't hurt me. The next 2 weeks were probably the hardest in her life. The disease was ready to win, to take the artist with it, as it had already taken many and many. The doctor was from the same mafia. From close friends, came twice a day. The nurse came even more often. Her name was Isabella, and as Maggie realized, she had been in love with Taylor before. Isabella knew her work perfectly. She had a light hand for injections, but as often she had tears in her eyes, which is not typical of nurses. Maggie, Siri, in addition to night duty for the sick man, took care of the household. One day, when Evans had fallen asleep, she and Isabella, both drunk with fatigue, were drinking tea in the kitchen. You know, he's so simple, so kind, so available, Isabella said. And Maggie knew she was talking about Taylor, but he doesn't really want to love anyone else. And he's built this ice wall between himself and the people around him that's thin, transparent, you can't see it. But it's there. I tried, figuratively speaking, to press my whole body against it and melt it, but I couldn't. I just froze myself over and over again. And it hurt so much to thaw. Maggie was given strict orders from the doctor to take her temperature and saturation every hour, and if anything, to contact him at any time of the day or night. And then call an ambulance. Evans didn't complain, only said once with a guilty smile, I keep looking for a pose that will make it easier to breathe. My lungs feel like they're flooded with water. And then he had, children, don't worry. I've lived long enough. Don't worry about me. That day it seemed to her that an even more difficult time was coming and that the end might be near. So Maggie decided to go home and get some things so that she could stay here permanently. A few changes of underwear, the little things you can't do without if you're not in your own house. Maggie had everything she was going to take with her in a quarter of an hour. And then, she didn't know why, the movement was purely mechanical, automatic. She plugged the plug of the old radio into the socket. Every time she thought it would never come to life again, never make a noise. But it always woke up. There was a whistling sound, and then rustles, noises. Maggie spun the wheel slowly. Take the mirror to him, Anastasia said suddenly, as if she were in the next room. Maggie flinched so that the receiver almost fell out of her hands. Am I going crazy? She asked either herself or the radio, and almost immediately asked the question she thought she would never ask. Anastasia, what about my mom? Maggie hadn't thought of her mother in recent years, but now, as the emptiness approached, and no one would be by her side. She's not here, Anastasia said. Forgive me both, you and her. The noise came again, and it was so easy to imagine that it was all Maggie's imagination that she was beginning to have some sort of auditory hallucination from fatigue. And then she walked over and, biting her lip, began to remove the mirror from the wall. The Taylors' apartment was crowded until the evening, and this despite the fact that the doctor had forbidden all but the most important people to come, but there were quite a few of them. Besides his son, whose place was in any case here, there was Isabella, and also that partner who had sung with Evans for many years, and Thomas, who could not be excluded. But few people went into the room of the sick man himself. They crowded into the other rooms and into the kitchen, making tea and coffee, talking quietly. Everyone is surely waiting to say goodbye. Maggie's heart broke. But the sick man was dozing all the time. He didn't call out to anyone. Finally, near midnight, Maggie was the only one left in the house besides Evans. Usually this time was the most precious to the girl, but it was also the most difficult. She alone was responsible for anything that happened to Taylor during these hours. The sick man was half sitting up, covered with pillows, breathing hard, but each time he asked Maggie not to sit beside him, but to go to bed. Put my tea on the table and go. He pleaded. I promise. If anything, I'll call. He's not strong enough to call, Maggie used to think, but he's delicate enough. He'll try to go to the afterlife quietly, so as not to disturb anyone. And she distracted Taylor as much as she could, asked him about plays, about roles, about familiar artists. But often, when he enthusiastically began to tell, she noticed that he was choking, and then began to talk about anything herself, as long as he didn't chase her away. But presently she brought him tea, and immediately went out and returned, carrying back the heavy thing. No, what is it? Evans asked quietly. The disease wouldn't let him speak any louder. "Mirror, look at yourself. You want to show me how sick and ugly I've gotten." Taylor stroked her arm with dry, hot fingers. "Maggie, I already know. Don't, really. You were welcome." Never had such a pleading tone been in her voice. And he looked. There was silence. Maggie looked not at the mirror, but at Evans. At first his face became more and more stern even. It was the way one might look at an approaching storm, at an enemy on the offensive, and at the last line beyond which was eternity. Then his expression changed now. Evans looked as if he was eagerly waiting for the judge to pronounce a verdict or acquittal. And finally, tears came to his eyes. Then Maggie stepped back and looked too. He was very young there. That Taylor remained a child at heart, she knew. But now it was confirmed. Maybe only a little older than she was, about 25 years old, but no more. Not a king, but a prince. And yet, it was undeniably him, impossible not to recognize. And his gaze was both trusting and wise and something else. It was as if he knew everything, as if he'd been where Anastasia was now. Evans sighed convulsively, but as deeply as if the air had finally broken through his chest. "I'm out of breath," he said, not believing himself, "but I can't be like this. If I am like this, then all of life is justified. It means that in what I've experienced, I've kept my soul." Maggie cried, covering her face with her hands. She felt as if she were the one who had been pardoned. "No, Thomas," Evans said. "I'm done with the stage. After what I've been through, I'm tired and out of breath. But that's not the point. I still want to live, you know, all my life in art, in the realm of shadows, in imaginary images. And life slipped through my fingers. Now, as long as I am destined there, I want to go out on the grass in the morning to walk barefoot on it. I want to plant a garden, damn it. I want to go to the sea, not during the time free from touring, but when I want to see it." "That's quite a gift you've given yourself," Adam said. They walked slowly, turning from one garden path to another. Evans had sold his luxurious bar apartment, withdrawn his savings from the bank, and bought the old house. "It's not a gift for me," Taylor said seriously, "or rather, it's not just for me. It's primarily for her." Maggie was in the house, fiddling with dinner. "And of course, nothing will change for you," Evans went on. "All my friends can come to see me whenever they like, as long as they like. We'll have a table here in the garden, under the awning. Oh, what evenings we'll have. I think the house has learned a lot, too, in the time it's been in other people's hands. It won't be so unsociable now." "You look a lot younger than you used to," Adams looked at his friend, and an involuntary smile touched his lips. "We were scared for you back then. But it turns out your illness has done you good." Taylor patted him on the shoulder. They were silent for a moment. "Now I'm waiting." Evans couldn't procrastinate any longer. "Did you find her?" "Yes," the journalist took a piece of paper out of his pocket and handed it to him. "Maggie's mother's alive. She moved to a neighboring town, probably didn't want to see a place where everything reminded her of. She never married again, no children, working home, lives pretty much reclusive. Here's her address and phone number, of course. I didn't tell her myself. That's between you and Maggie." "I should probably be the first one to call," Evans said worriedly. It would be too much of a shock if she heard her daughter's voice right away. And Maggie should be careful because she doesn't know yet either. Of course you don't die of joy, but if she could die, it was when we were all afraid for you. Do you remember what she was like then? She was black all over. Now I regret turning down the hospital, and she saw the whole thing. I should have gone in there behind closed doors. But then she wouldn't have saved you," Adam said simply. "So this whole chain, the whole thing, since that terrible flood, not one link in it was random, as nothing is random or meaningless." Maggie's voice came from inside the house. Now that she could breathe easier, she made coffee and hummed something simple, because she knew the old house wanted to hear living voices.